Across the United States, some towns hide tragedies that time has almost erased. Streets appear ordinary, homes familiar, yet beneath the surface, disappearances, unexplained fires, and unsolved deaths linger as shadows on the landscape. These events are often remembered only in whispers, fading photographs, or the stories of a few who dared to speak. As you move through overgrown trails, abandoned cabins, and silent town squares, the remnants of these forgotten tragedies begin to reveal themselves. Footsteps echo in empty streets, scorched floors and overturned chairs hint at sudden violence, and whispered legends linger in the corners. Each town presents a story of loss, fear, and unanswered questions, drawing you into America's most enigmatic and haunting corners. Centralia, Pennsylvania, the town that's still burning. Centralia lies in the rolling hills of eastern Pennsylvania, once one of many small coal towns that dotted the anthracite region. In the early 20th century, it was a modest but active community where miners descended daily into dark shafts beneath the earth, and families gathered along tidy streets lined with wooden homes and storefronts. Beneath the town stretched a maze of coal veins that had been carved and tunneled for generations. Few residents imagined that this hidden landscape would one day determine the fate of everything above it. Yet the tragedy that would eventually erase Centralia did not arrive suddenly. It began quietly in 1962 with a fire that no one believed could survive. By the spring of that year, Centralia had already changed from its earlier prosperity. The coal industry had begun to fade, and many young people had left for larger cities, though about 1,000 residents still called the town home. Local traditions remained strong, especially the annual preparations for Memorial Day. In May 1962, the Borough Council arranged for a familiar task that had been carried out many times before. The town landfill, located in a former strip mine near the Oddfellows Cemetery, needed to be cleaned before visitors arrived for the holiday. Firefighters were asked to burn the accumulated trash, a routine practice that had rarely caused concern. On May 27th, volunteer firefighters set the landfill ablaze as they had in previous years. The flames consumed piles of refuse and smouldered through the pit for hours. At first, nothing appeared unusual, yet beneath the landfill lay exposed seams of anthracite coal that had been left behind after earlier mining operations. Somewhere below the burning trash, heat reached one of those seams. When the firefighters finished their work, a fire had already slipped downward through cracks and tunnels, feeding on coal that had formed millions of years earlier. What began as an ordinary cleanup had quietly connected with a vast underground fuel source. In the weeks that followed, residents noticed strange signs. Smoke drifted from cracks in the ground near the landfill. Firefighters attempted to extinguish the flames by pouring water into the pit, but the smoke returned. Borough officials contacted the Pennsylvania Department of Mines and Mineral Industries, which sent investigators to inspect the site. Their early reports suggested that the fire had spread into abandoned mine passages beneath Centralia. These tunnels stretched for miles under the surrounding hills, linking coal seams that had once supplied the region's economy. If flames had entered that network, they would have had access to an almost limitless supply of combustible material. Attempts to contain the blaze began almost immediately. Crews dug trenches to isolate the burning seam and tried to smother the fire with water and non-flammable materials. Each effort met the same problem. The underground mine workings were far larger and more complex than early maps suggested. Some tunnels had collapsed or been forgotten entirely, allowing the fire to move unpredictably through oxygen-rich pockets. By the end of 1962, engineers realized that the blaze had spread beyond the original landfill area. Instead of a single burning pit, they were facing an expanding underground fire that could travel through the coalfield itself. During the following years, the ground above Centralia began to show subtle but unsettling changes. Warm air drifted from fissures that opened in empty lots and wooded hillsides. Steam sometimes rose from the earth on cold mornings. The smell of sulphur and burning coal lingered in certain areas, particularly near the old mining zones. Scientists studying the phenomenon understood that coal fires could burn for decades if left unchecked. The anthracite seams beneath Centralia were thick and interconnected, creating conditions where flames could slowly migrate underground while remaining hidden from view. By the late 1970s, the situation had grown more serious. Carbon monoxide levels measured in some basements were rising to dangerous levels. One widely reported incident occurred in 1981 when a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski fell into a sudden sinkhole that opened in a backyard. The hole measured several feet wide and released hot gas from the fire burning below. Todd managed to cling to a tree root until he was pulled to safety by a relative, but the event demonstrated how unstable the ground had become. Beneath the quiet streets of Centralia, the fire had hollowed out vast areas of coal. State and federal authorities began to debate how the town could be protected. Engineers estimated that completely extinguishing the fire might cost hundreds of millions of dollars with no guarantee of success. The blaze had already spread far beyond the landfill where it started. In some locations, the underground temperature exceeded several hundred degrees, making direct intervention extremely difficult. As studies continued, the fire kept moving slowly through the coal seams, releasing heat and toxic gases. Residents could not always see it, but the earth beneath them had become a vast, burning labyrinth. During the early 1980s, the federal government concluded that relocation offered the safest solution. In 1984, Congress approved more than $40 million to buy homes in Centralia and assist residents who agreed to leave. Many families accepted the offer, though the decision was painful for people whose roots in the town stretched back generations. Houses were gradually demolished as their owners moved away. Streets that once held rows of homes became empty stretches of pavement surrounded by grass and trees. Centralia was not destroyed in a single catastrophe, but erased slowly through absence. Even as the population dwindled, a small number of residents chose to remain. They argued that their homes were still safe and that the town represented an irreplaceable piece of personal history. Legal battles continued for years while the government proceeded with its relocation program. In 1992, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania used eminent domain to condemn the remaining properties, though several residents were eventually allowed to stay for the rest of their lives. By that time, Centralia had already become a place unlike any other town in the region. Visitors who approached the area during the 1990s often encountered a landscape that felt strangely incomplete. Blocks of empty land marked where houses once stood. Sections of road buckled and cracked as heat rose from below. One nearby highway, Pennsylvania Route 61, became famous for its warped pavement and drifting smoke before it was eventually closed and covered with soil. Though the visible flames were rare, the underground fire continued to burn through coal seams that extended beyond the abandoned borough. Scientists studying Centralia concluded that the blaze could remain active for centuries if enough fuel remained underground. Coal fires elsewhere in the world have burned for hundreds or even thousands of years under similar conditions. The slow movement of oxygen through fractured rock allows combustion to continue in deep layers that are nearly impossible to reach. Centralia's fire has therefore become both a cautionary tale and a long-term geological phenomenon. What began as a routine landfill burn evolved into a persistent underground system of heat and gas that still reshapes the land above it. Today, only a handful of residents remain within the borough limits, surrounded by forests reclaiming streets that once held a thriving mining town. Smoke occasionally rises from vents in the earth, especially after rain or during cold weather when warm gases meet the surface air. Monitoring continues, though officials acknowledge that the fire itself cannot realistically be extinguished with current methods. Centralia has become less a town than a quiet reminder of the hidden forces beneath the ground. Even now, instruments occasionally detect shifting heat patterns beneath the hills, suggesting the flames continue to wander through unseen corridors of coal. Geologists believe parts of the fire may still be moving slowly through seams that extend far beyond the abandoned borough. And somewhere beneath those silent hills, the coal still burns. Villisca, Iowa, the house where 8 never woke up. On quiet summer evenings, in 1912, the small railroad town of Villisca, Iowa, settled into a rhythm of lantern-light church gatherings and the distant sound of trains crossing the prairie. It was a place where most residents knew one another by name, and where the events of a single household could quickly become known across the community. Nothing in the town's daily life suggested the kind of violence that would soon define its history. Yet one night in June would leave 8 people dead inside a modest home on East 2nd Street. The killings would shock the entire region, not only for their brutality but for the strange silence surrounding them. Among the families who lived along East 2nd Street were Josiah and Sarah Moore, whose modest white frame house held the ordinary routines of 6 people and, on one June evening, 2 young guests. Josiah Moore was a local businessman who worked as a dealer for the John Deere Plough Company, while Sarah cared for their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. The household was known in town as respectable and active in church life. On the evening before the tragedy, the Moore children had invited 2 sisters, Ina and Lena Stillinger, to spend the night. The girls lived nearby and often joined the Moore family at church events. Sunday, June 9, 1912, passed in Villisca with the familiar calm of a Midwestern weekend, culminating in a Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, attended by much of the town. The event included music, recitations, and performances by local children, many of whom had been practicing for weeks. Members of the Moore family participated, and neighbours later recalled seeing them smiling and speaking with friends afterward. As the program ended, families began walking home beneath the warm early summer sky. The Moore household returned to their home shortly before 10 that night. Inside the small house, preparations for sleep followed a routine that must have felt entirely ordinary. After the lamps were extinguished and the Moore household settled into sleep, the house entered a stretch of hours that investigators would later attempt to reconstruct without a single surviving witness. Sometime after midnight, an intruder moved through the rooms of the home carrying an axe taken from the Moore family's own woodpile. One by one, the 8 occupants were attacked while they slept in their beds. Evidence later suggested that the killer moved carefully through the house, pausing between rooms and returning more than once. No neighbour reported hearing cries or signs of struggle during the night, leaving investigators with a crime committed almost entirely in silence. Morning arrived quietly on June 10th, yet something about the Moore home felt strangely still to those who passed along the street. The family usually began their day early, and neighbours noticed that no one had come outside to begin the usual morning chores. A neighbour named Mary Peckham eventually grew concerned when her repeated knocks on the door went unanswered. Unable to rouse anyone inside, she asked Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, to investigate. When Ross entered the house, he quickly realised something was terribly wrong and rushed outside to summon help. Within minutes, the quiet street began filling with anxious residents. Inside the small house, the discovery that followed revealed a scene that investigators would later describe as one of the most baffling crimes in the region's history. The bodies of all 8 victims were found in their beds across several rooms of the home. The axe used in the murders had been left behind, leaning against a wall in the downstairs bedroom. Several unusual details added to the confusion of the crime scene. Mirrors inside the house had been covered with pieces of clothing, and a kerosene lamp had been placed near the foot of one bed with its chimney removed. Doors were locked, yet no clear sign showed how the killer had entered or escaped. News of the killings spread through Villisca with astonishing speed, drawing neighbours, lawmen, and curious visitors to the house before the investigation had even begun in earnest. In the early 20th century, crime scene procedures were far less controlled than they are today. Dozens of people entered the home during the first hours after the discovery, unintentionally disturbing evidence that might have helped identify the attacker. Detectives arrived from surrounding areas, but by then the small house had already been crowded with onlookers. Even experienced investigators struggled to determine which clues were meaningful and which had been altered by the movement of so many people. In the uneasy days that followed, suspicion moved through the town almost as quickly as the rumours whispered along its streets. Some residents wondered whether the crime had been committed by someone familiar with the Moore family and the layout of the house. Others speculated that a stranger might have entered the town unnoticed, carrying out the murders before slipping away. Investigators examined the possibility of business disputes involving Josiah Moore, whose work required frequent travel. Each new theory seemed plausible for a moment before dissolving under closer scrutiny. The town that once shared quiet routines now shared a growing sense of uncertainty. One name that soon emerged from the expanding investigation was William Mansfield, a travelling preacher whose past movements drew the attention of detectives. Authorities believed Mansfield might have been responsible for a series of similar killings in other states. Investigators studied his travel records and questioned witnesses who claimed to have seen him near Villisca around the time of the murders. The theory suggested a pattern of attacks carried out by someone moving between towns under the cover of religious work. Yet the evidence linking Mansfield to the Villisca case remained circumstantial, and prosecutors struggled to build a case strong enough to bring to trial. As the months passed without an arrest, the Villisca murders began to attract speculation that reached far beyond the quiet Iowa town. Newspapers across the Midwest reported new theories, each attempting to explain how such a crime could occur in a peaceful community. Private detectives offered competing explanations, while investigators continued to examine possible motives involving jealousy, revenge, or mental instability. Despite the growing attention, the case seemed to drift further from resolution. Each lead raised new questions while leaving the central mystery untouched. Who had entered the Moore home that night, and why? Nearly 5 years after the killings, authorities placed their hopes on a suspect whose strange confession seemed for a moment to promise answers. Reverend George Kelly, a travelling minister who had visited Villisca shortly before the murders, was arrested in 1917 after sending investigators a series of unsettling letters. During questioning, Kelly confessed to the crime in a rambling statement that many observers found difficult to interpret. Soon afterward, he recanted, claiming the confession had been forced. His trial drew national attention, but the evidence presented proved inconsistent. After long deliberation, the jury failed to reach a conviction, leaving the case unresolved once again. Decades later, the house on East 2nd Street remained standing, its narrow staircase and small bedrooms preserved much as they were on the night of the crime. Over time, the structure became one of the most well-known unsolved crime scenes in the United States. Historians and investigators have revisited the evidence repeatedly, hoping that overlooked details might reveal the truth. Visitors who walk through the rooms today encounter a house that appears ordinary in nearly every respect. The quiet spaces make the events of 1912 seem even more difficult to comprehend. Even after generations have studied the case, several details recorded in the original investigation continue to resist simple explanation. Detectives noted that the killer appeared to have remained inside the house for some time after the murders, possibly washing in a basin and preparing food in the kitchen. The reason the mirrors were covered has never been determined, nor has the purpose of the lamp placed near the bed. These details suggest a presence that lingered in the house long after the violence ended, moving calmly through rooms that had fallen silent. In the silence of that small Iowa house, the events of one summer night still seem to end in a question no investigation has ever resolved. Keddie, California. The Cabin 28 Massacre. Hidden among the pine-covered slopes of California's northern Sierra Nevada stood a small cluster of cabins known as Keddie Resort. The settlement rested along a narrow valley in Plumas County, a quiet area where forested hills met the winding course of the Feather River. Travelers occasionally stopped there, drawn by the calm scenery and the modest cabins that lined the wooded landscape. Yet the place would eventually become known for something far darker. In April 1981, a violent crime inside one of those cabins shattered the stillness of the valley. What happened in Cabin 28 would leave investigators with questions that lingered long after the community itself began to fade. Scattered along a narrow valley near the Feather River, the cabins of Keddie formed a quiet settlement where residents lived beside vacationers and the occasional passing train. The Western Pacific Railroad line ran through the canyon nearby, its locomotives echoing through the trees as they passed between the mountains. Some cabins served as seasonal rentals, while others were occupied by families who had settled there more permanently. Life in the area unfolded slowly, shaped by the surrounding forest and the distance from larger towns. Residents knew one another in passing, sharing the routines of a small community surrounded by wilderness. Living in one of those cabins during the early 1980s was Sue Sharp, a mother who had recently moved her family into Cabin 28. Sue had relocated to Keddie from Connecticut with several of her children, hoping to begin a quieter chapter of life in the rural mountains of Northern California. The cabin itself stood near the edge of the settlement, slightly raised above the ground on wooden supports. Inside lived Sue and 3 of her children, while older family members and friends often visited or spent time nearby. The Sharp household blended into the quiet rhythms of Keddie, appearing little different from the other cabins scattered through the trees. On the evening of April 11th, 1981, the routines inside Cabin 28 unfolded much like any other Saturday in the small mountain community. Members of the Sharp family spent time visiting neighbours and friends in nearby cabins. Some of the children walked through the resort area, moving between houses in a place where distances were short and the atmosphere remained familiar. The surrounding forest darkened as night settled across the valley, and by late evening most residents had returned indoors. From the outside, nothing about Cabin 28 suggested that anything unusual was taking place within its walls. Shortly after sunrise the following morning, 15-year-old Sheila Sharp returned to the cabin after spending the night at a friend's house nearby. The quiet of the early morning still surrounded the resort as she approached the familiar structure. What she discovered inside quickly transformed the calm scene into one of confusion and shock. Authorities would soon learn that several people inside the cabin had been killed during the night. Within hours, the small mountain settlement found itself at the center of a crime that few residents could comprehend. What investigators encountered inside Cabin 28 would quickly transform the quiet resort into the center of one of California's most puzzling murder investigations. Inside the living room, 3 victims were discovered bound and severely injured. Sue Sharp, along with her son John Sharp and his friend Dana Wingate, had been attacked in a violent struggle. Evidence suggested that the victims had been restrained using electrical cords and medical tape before the attack took place. The scene revealed signs of a confrontation that had unfolded within the cabin during the night. Yet other rooms in the house showed a different and more unsettling detail. Amid the confusion surrounding the crime scene, authorities soon realized that 12-year-old Tina Sharp was nowhere to be found. Her absence immediately raised new concerns about what had occurred during the night. While several people had been attacked inside the cabin, Tina had disappeared entirely from the scene. Investigators began searching the surrounding woods and nearby roads, uncertain whether she had fled, been taken, or met the same fate as the others. The quiet forest surrounding Keddie suddenly became part of a much wider search, as authorities tried to determine what had happened after the violence inside Cabin 28. As detectives began questioning witnesses and examining the cabin, the investigation quickly became tangled in conflicting accounts and incomplete evidence. Residents of the small community offered statements about movements they had seen during the evening and night before the crime was discovered. Some mentioned unfamiliar activity near the cabins, while others recalled hearing sounds that seemed unusual only in hindsight. The remote location of the resort complicated the work of investigators who were trying to reconstruct the sequence of events. In many ways, the setting that had once made Keddie peaceful now made the case more difficult to solve. Not long after the murders became public knowledge, an unsettling phone call reached the Butte County Sheriff's Office. The caller, whose identity was never confirmed, appeared to possess knowledge of the crime that had not yet been released publicly. Details provided during the call suggested that the person might have known something about what had occurred inside Cabin 28. Yet investigators were unable to trace the call or determine who had made it. The brief conversation became one more fragment of uncertainty in a case already filled with unanswered questions. Attention eventually turned toward 2 men who had been staying in a nearby cabin, and whose behavior after the killings raised troubling questions. Martin Smart and his friend John Beau Bubed had been living close to the Sharp family at the time of the crime. Witnesses later reported statements and actions that led investigators to consider them possible suspects. Smart in particular drew attention when accounts emerged suggesting he had spoken about the murders in disturbing ways. Despite the suspicion surrounding them, neither man was formally charged in connection with the case. Years later, investigators reviewing the case files discovered that some of the original evidence had never been properly preserved or examined. Documents suggested that key items collected during the investigation were misplaced or overlooked during the early stages of the case. In some instances, leads that might have been pursued further appeared to have ended abruptly. As detectives revisited the files decades later, they began to realize how much of the original investigation had been left incomplete. The passage of time had turned what might once have been solvable clues into fading traces within aging records. 3 years after the events in Cabin 28, a discovery in a remote part of Butte County brought a painful piece of the mystery back into the light. In 1984, human remains were found in a wooded area near Camp 18 Road. Authorities eventually confirmed that the remains belonged to Tina Sharp, whose disappearance had troubled investigators since the morning of the crime. The discovery answered one question while raising many others about how she'd been taken from the cabin and transported miles away. Even with this new information, the case still refused to reveal a clear explanation. A long time after the crime, detectives and independent investigators returned to the Keddie files, hoping that overlooked details might still reveal the truth. Advances in forensic technology encouraged renewed interest in evidence that had once seemed too limited to analyse. Journalists and researchers studying the case began piecing together fragments of witness statements and investigative records from the early 1980s. Their work suggested that certain individuals may have been closer to the truth than originally believed. Yet despite renewed attention, the mystery of Cabin 28 has never been officially resolved. The Quiet Valley, home to the remaining cabins, still holds Cabin 28's story as an open puzzle rather than a resolved case. Circleville, Ohio. The writer who terrorised a town. The first letter arrived on a quiet morning in 1976, its folded edges and typed words carrying a message no resident could ignore. The envelope contained threats and accusations directed at Mary Gillespie, a local school bus driver, suggesting knowledge of her personal life that no outsider could have known. Its tone was formal but unnerving, casually mixing mundane details with pointed insinuations. The words inside unsettled her, planting the first seeds of fear that would soon grow into a pervasive anxiety across the town. For a place like Circleville, Ohio, this intrusion into private life felt entirely unnatural, a quiet horror that began in writing but would not remain confined to paper. Neighbours whispered about the letter in hushed tones, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Small details, once ignored, suddenly became suspicious to everyone who lived nearby. Fear began to ripple silently through the streets, invisible yet undeniable. Each note contained details that no stranger should have known, as if the writer had been silently observing the smallest moments of daily life. They referenced conversations, relationships, and decisions that Mary had never shared publicly. Some passages hinted at secrets and personal indiscretions, others at imagined betrayals, but all conveyed a precise knowledge that suggested close surveillance. Those who later examined the letters noted the care in their composition, the typewritten letters choosing words to unsettle without overtly threatening. Every paragraph reinforced a sense that someone had entered her life unseen, tracking her movements and cataloguing private matters. In the months that followed, the letters multiplied, each one sharper, more pointed, and more invasive than the last. Where the initial messages had been cryptic, subsequent correspondence directly threatened specific actions against Mary or others close to her. Notes were sent not just to her but to neighbours, acquaintances and public officials, each one drawing attention to personal habits or small indiscretions. The escalation suggested that the writer's knowledge extended across the community, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that slowly began to permeate every corner of the town. Residents who once moved freely now imagined eyes watching from shadows. For Mary Gillespie, the content of the letters made ordinary routines feel unsafe, turning her own home into a space of unease. She began changing routes to the bus garage, checking doors multiple times and hesitating before answering knocks at the door. Even familiar neighbours felt uncertain under the scrutiny implied by the correspondence. Some townspeople noticed her anxiety, but the precise nature of the threat remained invisible, leaving Mary isolated in her apprehension. Each letter seemed tailored to instill fear without offering any actionable clue about the sender, heightening her sense that the town itself had been infiltrated by an unknown observer. Police quickly realised they were facing something unusual, a persistent, careful correspondent who seemed intent on evading detection at every turn. Local law enforcement collected letters, examined the typewritten fonts, and attempted to trace postal marks. Interviews were conducted with neighbours and co-workers to identify potential suspects. The meticulous nature of the correspondence confounded traditional investigative techniques. Despite repeated efforts, the letters continued arriving, often containing information that police themselves had never publicly revealed, suggesting that the writer had access to knowledge beyond casual observation. Threatening calls soon accompanied the letters, a voice on the line that hinted at knowledge the town had not shared with anyone else. The calls often came at unpredictable hours, sometimes referencing events only hours old, demonstrating an unsettling immediacy. Recipients were left disoriented, uncertain whether the caller had been observing them directly or acting from information collected elsewhere. The combination of letters and calls created a dual pressure, a constant awareness that the unseen author could intrude at any moment, in writing or in person, making the town itself feel watched. Word of the letters spread beyond Circleville, drawing reporters who chronicled the growing fear and turned private terror into public fascination. Newspapers reported on the increasingly bold messages, analysing their tone and speculating about possible authors. For residents, the publicity was a double-edged sword. The wider attention underscored the seriousness of the threat, but also magnified paranoia, turning neighbours' casual glances into potential scrutiny. Rumours proliferated, pointing fingers at distant acquaintances or people who had left town. The community that once relied on familiarity now struggled to discern fact from speculation. Residents altered routines, changed locks, and installed security measures, yet every action seemed to be anticipated by an unseen observer. Mail was scrutinised before being opened, windows were checked for hidden surveillance, and families considered moving from their homes entirely. Yet the letters continued to arrive with uncanny timing and knowledge, their presence reinforcing the sense that ordinary precautions were inadequate. Each precaution, while sensible, only seemed to demonstrate the writer's persistence and ability to infiltrate lives despite barriers, feeding a cycle of fear and reactive vigilance that gripped Circleville. Investigators traced some letters, analysing postmarks, paper types, and handwriting, but the clues seemed designed to frustrate discovery rather than illuminate it. Fingerprints were smudged or absent, ink was consistent but generic, and postmarks often pointed to nearby towns, only to mislead. Forensic analysts noted that the letters were meticulously composed, deliberately avoiding stylistic markers that could identify the sender. Even the most thorough reviews of handwriting, typing, and mailing patterns yielded frustratingly little. The evidence existed but seemed intentionally designed to maintain mystery, as if the author enjoyed the confusion as much as the fear it created. The escalating harassment became deadly when Mary Gillespie's husband, Ron, was murdered, confirming the anonymous threats were more than words. His death introduced a tangible and violent dimension to what had begun as psychological terror. Investigators struggled to connect the murder to the letters with definitive proof, though circumstantial links suggested a common hand. The town's anxiety intensified, now grounded in the possibility that the unseen author could cross the line from words to fatal actions. This shift from harassment to violence altered both investigative focus and the community's sense of safety, leaving Circleville residents with a new, chilling awareness of vulnerability. The arrest of Paul Freshaw offered the town hope for closure, but a recanted confession and conflicting evidence left the case unresolved. Though initially implicated as the writer, Freshaw maintained a shifting narrative, casting doubt on the prosecution's assertions. Legal proceedings explored many angles, from personal vendettas to psychological pathology, yet no definitive verdict clarified the true identity of the terrorizing author. The uncertainty persisted, leaving investigators, journalists, and townspeople alike questioning whether anyone had truly been accountable for the years of letters and the murder that followed. The imprint of the letters lingered through the streets and homes of Circleville, quietly shaping how residents moved, spoke, and trusted one another. Families developed routines around postal delivery and phone usage. Neighbours monitored interactions for subtle anomalies. The letter's psychological effect persisted long after the immediate threat faded, embedding vigilance and suspicion into daily life. Even community gatherings carried an undercurrent of awareness, as if every conversation might be scrutinised. Some residents reported sleepless nights revisiting the letters in memory, fearing the unseen author might return. Others catalogued old envelopes and notes, hoping for clues that might never appear. The town itself seemed to carry the residue of a fear that could not be easily erased. Researchers and journalists continue to study the preserved correspondence, uncovering fragments of a campaign that once gripped an entire community in fear. The letters, now archived and examined decades later, reveal the painstaking care of the author, the precision of threats, and the breadth of knowledge accumulated over years. Those who analyse the documents note patterns, cross-referencing details with events in Circleville's history, yet the full identity of the writer remains elusive. The preservation of the letters ensures that the story continues to captivate, offering glimpses into a campaign that blurred the line between private life and public terror. The unanswered questions embedded in those letters remain, a reminder that someone once watched Circleville with an unnerving intimacy. Hinterkaifeck's American Echo Hinterland Ranch, Colorado. Snow drifted across the unbroken fields surrounding Hinterland Ranch, giving the Colorado property a stillness that seemed to stretch for miles and forewarned of the tragedy that would come to define it. The house sat at the edge of a dense pine, its wooden siding weathered grey by relentless winters, while the barns and corrals lay in quiet disrepair. From a distance, the property appeared serene, almost idyllic, yet subtle hints of disorder betrayed the unease within. Nearby, snow-covered tracks hinted at movements that were neither entirely human nor explained by the family's routines. This ranch, remote and unguarded, would soon bear witness to a sequence of events that mirrored one of Europe's most infamous rural mysteries, leaving investigators and locals alike grappling with questions that remain unanswered. Inside the modest farmhouse, the family maintained routines shaped by isolation. Chores at dawn, livestock tended in the grey chill, and the persistent awareness of distance from neighbours. Each morning began with the measured rhythm of feeding animals, repairing fences and tending fields that stretched toward the horizon. The parents, a couple of steady dispositions, oversaw children whose movements were carefully observed, their lives tightly bound to the demands of the land. Visitors were rare, often delayed by the treacherous approach roads and the harsh Colorado weather. To outsiders, the family's seclusion might have appeared tranquil, yet such isolation amplified vulnerability, a fact that would become tragically evident when the shadow of violence fell upon them. Strange occurrences preceded the event. Broken tools left out of place, livestock spooked without reason, and footprints in the snow that led nowhere and vanished without explanation. Doors were occasionally found unlatched despite the family's meticulous habits. Windows would rattle in the wind, but sometimes the sound seemed deliberate, as if someone moved unseen across the porch or barn. Neighbours recalled hearing soft knocks in the dead of night or the muted creak of floorboards when the house should have been empty. These anomalies were subtle at first, dismissed as ordinary rural oddities, yet the repetition and specificity of the disturbances suggested an intruder was not merely passing by but watching, waiting. The discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves through the sparse community, revealing a scene of violence both intimate and inexplicably precise, leaving investigators scrambling for answers. Upon entering the house, law enforcement found the family slain within proximity, their positions and injuries signalling a methodical attack. The arrangement of objects in the home suggested the assailant had moved deliberately, leaving some items untouched while disturbing others in patterns that seemed calculated. The barn and livestock enclosures, normally lively, were silent and foreboding, adding a ghostly dimension to the scene. Locals described an unsettling sense that the property itself seemed to absorb the horror, every corner of the house holding a quiet echo of the tragedy. Examination of the crime scene offered details both chilling and puzzling. The arrangement of objects, marks in the dust, and wounds that suggested deliberation rather than chaos. Investigators noted that the killings appeared concentrated and deliberate, with certain areas of the home untouched, as if the perpetrator had followed an unspoken protocol. Footprints in snow and mud led to the property but often ended abruptly, suggesting the assailant had entered and exited with an almost impossible subtlety. Small items were moved, letters stacked oddly, and furniture disturbed in ways that conveyed both familiarity with the household and calculated intent. Each discovery compounded the impression that the murderer had been intimately aware of the family's routines, moving like a shadow through their lives. Neighbours reported hearing muffled cries, unexplained movements at night, and stories of lights flickering in windows, reinforcing the sense that something unseen had been present long before the bodies were found. Some claimed glimpses of figures in the tree line, others remembered lanterns glowing in unoccupied rooms. These accounts, often dismissed at the time, took on ominous weight in the aftermath of the murders. Even those who had initially shrugged off the disturbances began to question whether the ranch itself had been under silent surveillance. Each testimony reinforced a growing narrative of predatory observation, a sense that the family's demise had been quietly anticipated. Authorities combed the property and questioned nearby residents, contending with a landscape of deep woods and snowdrifts that made standard investigative techniques slow and uncertain. Tracks vanished into dense thickets or melted away in the shifting snow, frustrating efforts to trace any potential perpetrator. Evidence collected from the home offered minimal clues, with few objects carrying identifiable fingerprints or traces of DNA. The remoteness of the property slowed response times and limited witness accounts, forcing investigators to rely on painstaking reconstruction rather than immediate leads. Every step revealed the difficulty of enforcing law in a landscape that seemed to conspire with concealment. The ranch's geography seemed to conspire with the mystery: narrow passes, dense timber, and harsh winters that could hide tracks and obscure any intruder's movements. Snowdrifts filled depressions where footsteps might have left impressions, while forests blocked lines of sight and muffled sounds. The surrounding hills provided both shelter and concealment, making observation of the property from afar difficult. Even daylight offered limited vantage points. Shadows and tree cover created blind spots that frustrated both law enforcement and casual visitors. In this setting, the very environment became a silent accomplice, shaping both the crime and the lingering sense of unease. Certain details defied explanation: missing items, doors left ajar, and signs that someone had entered and exited without leaving a trace, heightening the lingering sense of enigma. Small personal objects were found in places they would not naturally belong, while others vanished entirely. Investigators could not determine whether the displacements were deliberate or incidental, yet each anomaly added to the impression that the property itself held secrets beyond immediate comprehension. In the absence of a clear motive or suspect, the crime became a puzzle that would occupy investigators and historians for decades. Observers noted unsettling parallels to Hinterkaifeck in Germany: an isolated family, a barn near the house, and unexplained tracks, producing a psychological echo that stretched across continents. Scholars and journalists studying the case remarked on the uncanny similarities: a remote rural setting, intimate violence against a single family, and details suggesting surveillance of daily routines. Though unrelated in time and place, the American case mirrored the German tragedy in ways that intensified its eerie resonance. It became impossible to separate the horror of the act from the haunting parallels, amplifying the sense of inexorable fate in rural isolation. Residents responded with caution and whispering speculation, avoiding the ranch at night and debating rumours, even as official reports remained inconclusive. Some families refused to travel the nearby roads after dark, while others recounted stories passed from neighbour to neighbour, each retelling layering apprehension onto the next. Fear, tempered by fascination, became a defining characteristic of the surrounding community. The ranch, once a place of work and life, took on a mythic presence, an emblem of human vulnerability against unseen forces. In more recent years, researchers revisited archives and property maps, analysing every fragment of evidence, yet the core mystery, the identity and motive of the assailant, remains unresolved. Satellite imagery, aerial surveys, and modern forensics offered new insights into terrain and possible approaches, but none provided definitive answers. Every hypothesis encounters the same limitation. The combination of isolation, calculated movements, and environmental concealment renders the case almost impermeable. Scholars continue to debate whether the truth can ever be fully recovered from such a secluded and enigmatic setting. Overgrown paths, crumbling fences, and the quiet roar of distant winds mark the ranch, an environment that seems to retain the memory of violence in its stillness. Trees creak under their own weight. Snow gathers in silent drifts over footprints that may have been left years before, and the barns sag with age. Visitors describe a sensation that the property remembers its history, that every structure and hollowed-out field echoes the horror that transpired. Even in the absence of witnesses, the ranch communicates an undeniable presence, a lingering awareness of tragedy that refuses to be forgotten. It's as if the snow and stillness are keeping mysteries that may never be solved. Skidmore, Missouri, the murder everyone saw. A calm morning in Skidmore carried the illusion of safety, with shopkeepers arranging goods and children running along sidewalks, until a sudden act of violence shattered the rhythm of the town. The sunlight fell evenly across the streets, highlighting the orderly facades of small stores and homes, a normal day in a tight-knit community. Townspeople had begun their routines with the expectation that life would continue uninterrupted, yet in the span of minutes everything shifted. Horses in nearby stables neighed, disturbed by sudden commotion, while doors banged in open shops. It was a scene that began ordinarily, only to end in incomprehensible horror, witnessed by many yet understood by none. Some described a shadow that lingered in alleyways, a movement so fleeting it almost disappeared from memory, yet it left an uneasy mark in the collective awareness. The victim was a local farmer known for his daily routines and interactions with nearly every resident, a figure whose presence made the shock of his death all the more jarring. He had walked the same streets for years, greeted neighbours with familiarity, and maintained a farm that provided both livelihood and a quiet sense of civic contribution. His reputation as calm, methodical, and even-tempered made the violence all the more surreal. Townspeople knew him by sight and habit, and the suddenness of the attack made disbelief immediate. The knowledge that someone could commit a murder in full view of the community fractured the trust residents held in their seemingly secure environment. Some speculated quietly that the killer might have been someone known to the victim, someone trusted, which only added to the sense of paranoia that settled over Skidmore. What unfolded before dozens of eyes was brief yet devastating. A sudden confrontation, a single decisive act, and the air filled with disbelief as the scene registered in stunned silence. Witnesses would later describe the instant as if time slowed, with gestures, steps, and the fatal strike frozen in memory. There was no audible prelude, no shouted argument to herald what was to come, only a moment of shocking action. The starkness of the event, occurring in broad daylight and surrounded by onlookers, created a paradox: visibility without comprehension. Residents found themselves unable to intervene, trapped between recognition and helplessness. Even after decades, some who were present recall an inexplicable chill, a sensation as if the town itself held its breath at the precise moment of impact. People nearby froze mid-step, hands clenching railings and tools, as confusion rippled through the streets and the collective consciousness struggled to process a murder in plain view. Children fled toward their homes, parents shouted for order, and a few attempted to approach the scene but were stopped by the instinctive awareness that danger remained. The air seemed to thrum with tension, each person caught in the balance between action and observation. Even mundane sounds, dogs barking, wind rustling through leaves, felt amplified, pressing against the backdrop of human terror. The town had become both a witness and a participant in its own unravelling. Whispers spread of eyes catching fleeting figures in windows, someone moving on rooftops, and shadows that did not align with any human form, creating a subtle but persistent undercurrent of dread. Accounts quickly multiplied, each coloured by perspective and memory. Some described the suspect's clothing, others the victim's gestures, yet no story aligned perfectly with another. One neighbour emphasised the direction the perpetrator fled, while another swore it happened near a lamppost on the opposite street. Contradictions grew with each retelling, creating a network of narratives that confounded investigators. Memory itself became unreliable under the weight of shock, and the communal witnessing that could have solved the crime instead deepened the mystery. The murder existed simultaneously in multiple versions, each as credible and flawed as the next. Every attempt to reconcile testimonies seemed to create new uncertainties, and the question of whether anyone truly saw the killer's face lingered like a shadow over every account. Officers arrived to find a chaotic scene, witnesses scattered and conflicting, and the burden of untangling dozens of simultaneous observations that offered more questions than answers. Their attempts to coordinate testimony were thwarted by overlapping narratives and by the lingering emotional intensity of the onlookers. Roads were cordoned off, statements recorded, and yet the clarity necessary for solving the crime remained elusive. The police faced an unusual challenge. The crime had been visible, yet the combination of human error, panic, and social confusion ensured that no singular account could serve as definitive evidence. Even the simplest details, like the orientation of a fallen hat or the trajectory of a discarded tool, became subjects of dispute among witnesses. Investigation revealed subtle but telling details: footprints pressed into dirt, an object displaced during the attack, and the peculiar precision of the fatal strike that remained difficult to explain. The weapon used left minimal traces, and small items around the scene appeared deliberately untouched, suggesting intentional selection rather than randomness. Investigators noted that the attack was both direct and calculated, performed under the gaze of man, yet executed with striking efficiency. Every minor observation, the scuff of a shoe, the angle of a fallen item, became critical in attempting to reconstruct an event that seemed simultaneously public and private. Skidmore's narrow streets, clustered homes, and tight-knit social networks created both visibility and social pressure, amplifying the tension as residents simultaneously observed and speculated. Each home and storefront offered potential vantage points, yet the community's closeness complicated the pursuit of truth. Gossip intertwined with fact, and people feared speaking too plainly, uncertain whom to trust. The geography that made observation possible also constrained it, channeling attention along limited corridors and leaving gaps that obscured the perpetrator's movement. In this environment, the murder mystery persisted not for lack of witnesses, but because of the interplay between observation and human psychology. Whispers of past disagreements, minor feuds, and old grudges swirled through town, yet no single thread provided a clear motive, leaving the murderer's purpose suspended in uncertainty. Residents recounted histories of tension, arguments over land, financial disputes, and personal slights, each layered upon the ordinary fabric of rural life. Yet none could conclusively explain why the act had occurred or who had perpetrated it. The absence of motive intensified suspicion and anxiety, suggesting that even in public, violence could erupt without warning or justification. The town's collective consciousness became a maze of conjecture and fear. Even decades later, some speculate that the killer walked among the townspeople in the aftermath, unnoticed, blending seamlessly into the ordinary, a spectre in plain sight. Newspapers descended rapidly, chronicling every detail and replaying the scene in print, creating an amplified memory of the event that both preserved and distorted what had truly occurred. Reporters interviewed eyewitnesses, published conflicting timelines, and captured photographs that froze portions of the scene but revealed little about the assailant. Coverage transformed Skidmore into a stage, with the murder replayed for broader audiences yet remaining inexplicable even to those present. Media attention immortalized the moment, cementing it as a visible spectacle that defied resolution. Some editions printed letters from alleged witnesses claiming insight that could never be verified, further entangling fact with rumour. For months afterward, residents moved warily along familiar streets, aware that a violent act could erupt in full view yet remain unsolved, a fear compounded by the knowledge of communal helplessness. Patterns changed subtly. Fewer people lingered on sidewalks, children were escorted along narrow paths, and homes were secured more vigilantly. The memory of seeing death so plainly became a constant companion, colouring ordinary movements with caution. Public life carried the weight of collective trauma, a town perpetually aware of its own vulnerability. Multiple leads emerged and vanished, suspects were questioned and released, and forensic evidence that seemed promising offered no definitive answers, solidifying the event as a mystery that defied closure. Investigators were forced to reconcile the abundance of witness accounts with the lack of actionable evidence. Each contradictory statement, every untraceable path, widened the gap between observation and certainty. The case became emblematic of the paradox of public crime, witnessed by many, understood by none, and remaining unsolved despite exhaustive effort. Even today, artifacts from the case remain locked in archives, objects examined and re-examined but never fully decoded, as if the town itself resists revelation. Quiet streets now carry the echoes of that day, with subtle reminders in local memory and landscape, and the town's ordinary rhythms still bear traces of extraordinary terror. Fences, stoops and storefronts stand unchanged, yet the collective consciousness of Skidmore bears an invisible scar. Even newcomers eventually learn of the event, whispered through conversations and local lore. The murder has become both a historical incident and a lingering psychological imprint, shaping the town's identity and perception of safety. Though every eye in Skidmore saw that day unfold, the truth of what happened remains hidden in plain sight. Texarkana, Arkansas, the Phantom of the Moonlight Murders. Moonlight spilled over the quiet streets of Texarkana, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to pulse with an unseen presence. The air was still, the kind of calm that stretches across a town like a fragile veil ready to be pierced by the unexpected. On that fateful spring night in 1946, the illusion of security began to unravel. Ordinary routines, returning from work, evening walks, late-night errands, were suddenly interrupted by a force that defied comprehension. Residents would later recount the sense that the town itself had grown alert, every whisper of wind and rustle of leaves magnified into something portentous. The moonlight glinted off empty streets, highlighting the ordinary world that would soon be terrorized. Shadows shifted in ways no passerby could fully explain, foreshadowing the presence of a predator who moved unseen yet watched with unnerving precision. Before fear gripped the community, Texarkana thrived as a crossroads town, its sidewalks filled with families and shopkeepers closing up for ordinary nights. Its population was small but tightly knit, and most residents had grown up knowing every face in town. Life followed predictable patterns, and darkness was merely the end of the day rather than a source of anxiety. The townspeople took comfort in familiarity, the rhythm of church bells, the click of shoes along wooden sidewalks, the glow of street lamps reflected on pavement. Yet the sense of calm concealed the vulnerability that would soon be exploited. Ordinary lives, intertwined through generations of acquaintance, became an inadvertent stage for an unpredictable terror. The murder that would unfold was not targeted towards strangers, but against anyone in the wrong place at the wrong time. The initial murders struck like lightning in the dark. Victims found on deserted roads, their routines interrupted by an invisible predator. The first attack, barely reported at the time, went unnoticed by all but those who stumbled upon the scene. Subsequent assaults followed a pattern of randomness, occurring hours apart and miles from one another, as if the killer sought to remind the town that no street, no corner, and no porch was safe. Each attack left the community in heightened anxiety, an invisible force reshaping the night itself. The terror was not confined to the immediate victims, it rippled outward, affecting anyone moving under moonlight. As news spread, neighbours began to measure each step, the darkness itself perceived as a possible accomplice to the phantom's intentions. Neighbours whispered behind drawn curtains, doors locked earlier than usual, and every passing car became a source of unease. People adjusted their routines, avoiding the isolated roads where attacks had occurred. Children's play was restricted to daylight hours, and even casual evening walks became exercises in calculation and vigilance. Families spoke in hushed tones, recounting rumours and citing reports, never certain which were credible. The collective atmosphere grew tense, each household maintaining a fragile sense of control while acknowledging the unseen threat that could strike anywhere. Ordinary sounds, footsteps on gravel, the distant bark of a dog, a gate squeaking in the wind, acquired new weight, a sinister cadence overlaying every moment of evening life. Police were stretched thin across state lines, hampered by jurisdictional confusion and a killer who seemed to vanish as quickly as he appeared. Texarkana straddled Arkansas and Texas, and early investigations were complicated by overlapping law enforcement authority. Officers patrolled neighbourhoods at night, questioning residents and setting watchpoints, yet the phantom continued to move unseen. Coordination between departments was slow, hampered by limited communication technology and the novelty of a cross-state manhunt. Detectives combed the countryside for evidence, yet every clue seemed to dissolve before yielding answers. Even in daylight, the town felt under surveillance, each officer aware that the next victim could appear before the sunset. Reports of a figure in dark clothing, sometimes seen alongside a suspicious vehicle, were conflicting and often contradictory, deepening the town's anxiety. One witness swore the man wore a white mask, another described a hat pulled low to obscure his face. Vehicle descriptions varied: a black Ford, a dark pickup, a car that seemed to appear and vanish without origin. Residents debated the direction of the attacker's movement, but no consensus could be reached. Each account, though earnest, highlighted the phantom's skill at eluding comprehension, leaving the town haunted not only by fear, but by uncertainty itself. Even the most attentive observers could not reconcile what they thought they saw with what had truly occurred. Clues were scarce: footprints in loose soil, tyre tracks fading on road edges, and little else to indicate the phantom's method or motive. Investigators combed the scene meticulously, yet the evidence offered only fragments. There was no consistent pattern in weapon choice or approach, suggesting careful planning and a singular intent to remain invisible. The absence of forensic certainty made the attacks feel more surreal, as though the town was preyed upon by a force outside ordinary understanding. Small details, a door ajar, a flashlight beam reflected on a distant fence, a discarded glove, became points of obsession for law enforcement, yet never led to a resolution. The Phantom's capacity to evade capture contributed as much to fear as the violence itself. Fear seeped into daily life, reshaping routines, giving rise to local legends, and blurring the line between reality and collective imagination. The community speculated about who might be next, how the attacks were orchestrated, and whether the killer observed them as they observed him. Stories spread quickly, each iteration growing in suspense. A fleeting shadow, a car parked too long, footsteps where none should have been. Adults spoke of hearing distant cries, children dreamt of masked figures appearing in alleyways, and every corner of the town became a potential scene of horror. By combining fact and folklore, the Phantom became more than a criminal. He became an enduring spectre haunting the collective consciousness of Texarkana. Each attack seemed to follow no predictable pattern, yet a subtle escalation in timing and location suggested a careful, calculating presence. The murderer's movements were deliberate, striking in sequences that defied ordinary logic, leaving investigators to wonder whether there was a hidden pattern yet to be discovered. Streets once considered safe became dangerous overnight. The Phantom seemed to exploit the mundane, appearing in areas previously assumed immune to threat. Residents began mapping movements, hoping to anticipate actions that might never repeat. The tension of anticipation was as gripping as the acts themselves, for fear thrives in the moments before an unseen threat emerges. Newspapers chronicled every detail with dramatic headlines, amplifying the town's fear and transforming the Phantom into a figure of folklore. Reporters arrived from neighbouring cities, documenting the uncertainty and providing national attention to an otherwise small town. Photographs captured ordinary streets now imbued with menace, while interviews with terrified witnesses preserved conflicting narratives in print. Headlines cast the attacks as both sensational and incomprehensible, further embedding the Phantom into Texarkana's cultural memory. Every retelling contributed to the myth, making it unclear where documented fact ended and legend began. Suspects were questioned, alibis checked, and clues chased, but each lead dissolved into frustration, leaving the town with more questions than answers. Men and women of varying backgrounds were investigated, yet no evidence led to prosecution. Some were innocent victims of circumstance. Others remained forever under suspicion. Despite repeated efforts, the Phantom eluded capture, leaving law enforcement grasping for a solution that never arrived. Every dead end strengthened the town's sense that the killer was always one step ahead, watching, waiting, and invisible. Stories of the moonlight murders persist, whispered in cafes and around campfires, merging documented facts with rumour. Visitors unfamiliar with the events find a town outwardly ordinary, yet conversations hint at a history of terror concealed beneath polite civility. Local historians reference the attacks in archived newspapers, while residents recount chilling details to those willing to listen. The legend of the Phantom endures, feeding curiosity and dread alike. Texarkana has become a place where history and memory converge, a setting where an unresolved threat continues to shape identity. The town sleeps uneasily under the silvered glow of the moon, and even familiar landmarks, railway crossings, abandoned fields, and shadowed riverbanks echo with the weight of an unseen presence that refuses explanation. Every quiet hour of the night seems to stretch longer, every rustle or creak magnified into a potential menace. Moonlight glints off surfaces in ways that mimic movement, creating illusions that reinforce the town's persistent anxiety. Even the most ordinary scenes, an empty porch, a closed gate, a single parked car, can evoke the sensation of being observed by something that cannot be caught. Even under the brightest moonlight, Texarkana could not escape the shadow of the Phantom, whose presence remains woven into the night itself. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, shadows before the Silver Bridge collapse. A quiet tension seemed to settle over Point Pleasant, invisible yet palpable, as if the town itself anticipated the strain lurking just beneath the bridge. Life continued with familiar rhythms. Shopkeepers arranged their wares, children walked home from school, and commuters made their way to work without a second thought. Yet beneath the mundane, subtle signs hinted at fragility. Residents often noticed slight tremors beneath their feet when crossing the Ohio River, and occasional vibrations rippled through the bridge that no one could fully explain. The town, outwardly ordinary, harboured a latent unease that whispered of events just beyond comprehension, a quiet warning woven into daily life. The Ohio River cut through the heart of the community, its surface calm yet hiding the relentless pressure that made the Silver Bridge a vital and fragile artery. Boats travelled slowly along its length, fishermen leaned over its banks, and bridges downstream received only passing attention. The Silver Bridge connected Arkansas and Ohio streets, providing the main route for commuters, trucks, and emergency vehicles alike. It was taken for granted as a reliable passage, yet engineers had long been aware that any structural weakness would not be a minor inconvenience. It could and would have consequences far beyond the immediate span. Engineers and maintenance crews had noted small anomalies, slight vibrations, rust along critical joints, and tension that occasionally whispered of unseen stress. Their inspections, while routine, revealed the accumulation of decades of strain, particularly in the steel eye-bars that bore the bridge's weight. Reports were filed and repairs planned, yet the limitations of mid-century inspection techniques left many questions unanswered. Every day the bridge carried more vehicles than its original design had accounted for, each crossing adding imperceptible pressure that compounded over the years. Subtle signs of fatigue accumulated quietly, invisible to the casual observer yet present in each shudder, each creak of metal under load. Whispers among neighbours carried tales of faint, unsettling noises at odd hours, and tremors felt beneath footsteps, giving an impression that the bridge bore more than just vehicles. Stories circulated of the bridge groaning in windless nights and cables trembling for no apparent reason. Some residents claimed they felt the structure vibrate as they drove across, though others dismissed such accounts as imagination. Regardless of interpretation, a shared unease grew within the community, an intangible sense that something significant and irreversible loomed nearby. Ordinary life persisted, but with a subtle undercurrent of anxiety that few could articulate, yet all could feel. In the outskirts and back alleys, a winged, red-eyed figure was said to appear at night, blending folklore with a pervasive sense of forewarning. Mothman sightings, reported in fields and on the edges of town, gained traction in local imagination. Residents who had previously dismissed odd shadows or unexplained lights began to see patterns, drawing connections between these mysterious sightings and the structural anxieties of the bridge. Skeptics remained, yet the legend persisted, entwining with factual concerns to produce a complex, unsettling aura over Point Pleasant. Whether omen or coincidence, the tales reinforced a sense of latent danger, feeding the town's collective unease. Print reports highlighted minor repairs and traffic delays, yet a subtle undertone suggested underlying strain that few could fully interpret. Local newspapers included brief mentions of corrosion inspections and budget requests for reinforcement, but these details went largely unnoticed by the general public. Only in retrospect did these articles read like faint warnings, hints of structural tension ignored amid daily life. Headlines that once seemed mundane, the addition of a lane, the replacement of a single beam, now take on the weight of foreshadowing, reminding the town that tragedy often begins quietly, in moments overlooked by routine vigilance. A ferry operator recounted seeing cables quiver unusually at dusk, while a shopkeeper remembered a dream in which the bridge snapped beneath the weight of everything it carried. Other residents recalled personal experiences that defied rational explanation, fleeting glimmers of motion in the corner of the eye, the sensation of being watched by invisible forces, and a pervasive, unnameable tension when near the bridge. Collectively, these accounts formed a patchwork of unease, interweaving the tangible and the inexplicable. Though dismissed individually, together they painted a picture of a town unknowingly perched on the edge of disaster, teetering between normalcy and catastrophe. Suspension chains and eye-bars integral to the bridge's structure had endured decades of strain. Technical warnings existed, yet few grasped the immediacy of the risk. The bridge's single eye-bar design, a limitation of the engineering standards of the 1920s, made it uniquely vulnerable. Each connection carried immense weight, yet inspection techniques at the time could not fully reveal microfractures that developed over the years. Engineers understood the theoretical risk, but the practical consequences of overloading and subtle metal fatigue were difficult to convey to the public. In hindsight, the bridge's design had left it suspended between reliability and fragility, an invisible threshold only the collapse would reveal. Spring rains swelled the river, currents tugged at pilings, and temperature shifts stressed steel in ways imperceptible to those crossing above. Seasonal fluctuations caused expansion and contraction of the structural components, subtly increasing fatigue in the bridge's critical points. Even minor environmental variations compounded the hidden weaknesses, creating conditions in which failure could occur without warning. Residents unaware of the interplay between weather, water and steel continued their daily routines, oblivious to the invisible forces acting upon the structure they trusted. The combination of human oversight and natural strain created a precarious balance, fragile enough to be undone by a single tipping point. Commuters and delivery trucks moved across the bridge as usual, unaware that subtle shudders and barely noticeable tremors hinted at a mounting tension. Vehicles of increasing weight and frequency crossed daily, amplifying stress in ways imperceptible to drivers. Traffic patterns, seemingly mundane, imposed cumulative pressure that exceeded original design expectations. Even minor irregularities, vehicles braking, wind gusts or slight misalignments in the roadway, added to the hidden instability. The bridge appeared ordinary, yet beneath the steel every load pushed it closer to a limit few could perceive, and none could anticipate fully. At precisely 5:04 p.m. on December 15, 1967, the bridge gave way, plunging cars and lives into the icy river below, transforming normalcy into instantaneous chaos. Steel snapped, cables parted, and concrete supports yielded, releasing the pent-up tension accumulated over decades. Vehicles fell into the swirling river, passengers trapped by circumstances that had seemed routine mere seconds before. The sound was deafening, yet the impact was immediate and surreal, leaving survivors in shock and the town in stunned disbelief. Chaos spread across riverbanks, the ordinary evening erupting into a disaster no one had imagined, but that countless subtle signs had silently foreshadowed. Rescue teams scrambled, townspeople gathered at the riverbanks, and the full scale of loss was revealed, each survivor grappling with the sudden rupture of safety. Efforts to retrieve those trapped in the water were hampered by the current and icy conditions. Families searched desperately, calling names into the night, while emergency crews coordinated their response. Amid the devastation, a communal recognition emerged. The ordinary, the routine, and the familiar had been irrevocably disrupted. The town confronted both grief and disbelief, its sense of security shattered alongside the bridge itself. Accounts persist of strange premonitions and subtle anomalies preceding the collapse, reminders that some warnings remain too faint to be recognized until it is too late. Odd vibrations, inexplicable sounds, and sightings of unusual creatures became intertwined with documented structural warnings, forming a tapestry of uncertainty and mystery. Scholars, engineers, and folklorists have revisited these narratives, seeking explanations, yet the sense of unseen tension that pervaded Point Pleasant before the disaster remains elusive. The memory of the town, the river, and the bridge carries a spectral weight, a silent reminder of how fragile the line between normalcy and catastrophe can be. The Silver Bridge still casts its shadow over Point Pleasant in memory, standing as a testament to forces both tangible and mysterious, and to warnings barely noticed. Lake Shawnee, West Virginia, the playground built on tragedy. The waters of Lake Shawnee ripple deceptively calm, hiding decades of sorrow and lives lost long before children ever ran along its shores. Visitors to the area may notice the lake's placid surface reflecting the surrounding trees, yet beneath that reflection lies a history marked by tragedy. Long before any swings or merry-go-rounds were installed, accidents and deaths occurred on the land, shaping a legacy few dared to articulate. Even today, the atmosphere carries a sense of unease, as if the lake remembers what transpired there, and the shadows along its banks whisper tales of misfortune that have refused to fade with time. Early settlers cleared the land with hope, yet the fertile hills and calm waters soon became marked by misfortune and unexplained accidents. Families arrived with ambitions for farming and community, but misadventures followed. Drownings in the lake, mining-related incidents, and other sudden deaths punctuated the history of daily life, leaving an indelible mark on both land and memory. These early tragedies were recorded in local accounts, census notes, and newspaper clippings, each documentation quietly preserving a pattern of sorrow. Over time, these events coalesced into a collective memory, an invisible tension that lingered across generations despite attempts to build anew. Families endured drownings, mine collapses, and sudden deaths, each incident leaving a shadow that lingered long after the victims were gone. Some of these losses occurred in plain view of neighbours, while others remained mysteries sudden and inexplicable. The cumulative weight of these tragedies earned the site a quiet notoriety, reputation whispered among locals but largely unknown beyond the county. These shadows of the past were not easily erased. Every structure built and path cleared seemed to carry a lingering memory of what had been lost, an unspoken awareness that the land demanded caution, respect, and remembrance. In the mid-20th century, entrepreneurs transformed the site into an amusement park, seemingly oblivious to the weight of the land's past. The park was intended to bring joy, adventure, and economic growth to the area, its colourful rides and playful attractions masking the ominous history beneath. Families were welcome to picnic areas, swings, and rides built around the lake, yet the laughter that filled the air could not entirely dispel the unease that had accumulated over decades. Even construction crews noticed anomalies, foundations that seemed resistant to excavation, equipment that malfunctioned inexplicably, and subtle tremors underfoot. Despite these signs, commercial optimism carried the day, and the park opened to public curiosity and delight. Those visiting began reporting strange sensations near the rides, from sudden chills to fleeting shadows, incidents dismissed as imagination or coincidence. Children claimed to hear whispers when alone, and adults occasionally felt an unseen presence brushing past their shoulders. These occurrences were rare and inconsistent, yet their persistence contributed to a growing sense that something unseen lingered on the property. Photographs occasionally captured blurred figures where none should exist, and playground equipment creaked as if moved by invisible hands. While some attributed these experiences to overactive imaginations or environmental factors, the accounts accumulated into a pattern that could not be entirely explained. Locals expressed unease and whispered warnings, recounting tales of misfortune linked to the property that the park's management refused to acknowledge. Stories passed from generation to generation suggested that the amusement park had been built on cursed or ill-fated ground, though no formal record could confirm such a claim. Residents who worked in the area or lived nearby reported subtle but persistent disturbances, swings that moved when no one was present, lights flickering without cause, and animals reacting nervously to unseen stimuli. These reports added weight to the park's eerie reputation, creating a tension between entertainment and apprehension that lingered over each visit. Photographs captured unexplained shapes, and anecdotal accounts described unseen presences watching from tree lines or abandoned corners of the grounds. Visitors described moments of vertigo, sudden disorientation, or the sensation of being followed along the walkways. Some recalled faint laughter or footsteps echoing where no one else was present, while others noted objects moved inexplicably, chairs shifted, and benches occupied by no one. Collectively, these experiences created a landscape where joy and fear intertwined, a paradoxical environment in which the intended purpose of recreation was overshadowed by an invisible history of sorrow. After a series of accidents and mounting public concern, the park closed, leaving empty rides that slowly succumbed to rust and decay. The merry-go-rounds froze in mid-spin, swings sagged under the weight of time, and pathways became overgrown with weeds. Visitors ceased to arrive, and the area became largely abandoned, though curiosity seekers and urban explorers still ventured onto the grounds. Despite the absence of active amusement, the site retained a palpable atmosphere of unrest, as though the land itself refused to settle. Its decay became a symbol of both the impermanence of human enterprise and the persistence of the tragedies upon which it was built. Stories circulated of ghostly children running along the walkways and shadowy figures perched atop swings, blurring the line between memory and legend. Folklore mingled with factual history, producing a narrative that was part cautionary tale, part inexplicable phenomenon. Witnesses described moments where the air felt colder than ambient temperature, or where unseen eyes seemed to track movement through the trees. These accounts, while anecdotal, were consistent enough to suggest a lingering presence, a form of memory or consciousness anchored in the site's violent past. Whether these stories represented supernatural echoes or collective psychological imprint, they reinforced the haunting reputation of Lake Shawnee. Weeds burst through cracked pavement, roller coaster tracks sagged under the weight of time, and the surrounding forest crept inward, reclaiming what had been disturbed. nature moved deliberately, erasing the boundaries created by human ambition. The remnants of park infrastructure now seemed alien and foreboding, providing strange silhouettes amid the overgrowth. Even on sunny days, shadows lengthened unnaturally across the abandoned rides, hinting at the duality of decay and memory. The visual contrast between playground equipment and surrounding wilderness created an unsettling impression, as though joy had been overtaken by the land's deeper narrative. Historical records confirm the accidents, while local journalists documented eerie occurrences, noting that the park's tragic reputation persisted long after closure. Archived articles detailed drownings, injuries, and mysterious mishaps, many occurring in locations that would later become part of the amusement park. Despite public fascination with the folklore, these factual accounts painted a sober picture of the site's troubled history. Investigators and historians alike observed that tragedies were not isolated but formed a pattern across decades, reinforcing the sense that the land bore the weight of events that could not be fully understood or erased. Generations of children grew up hearing whispered warnings, their perception of the land coloured by tales that mingled fact, fear, and folklore. Local schools, community gatherings, and family narratives ensured that the story of Lake Shawnee persisted. Even those who never visited the site knew of its eerie reputation, and the collective imagination of the town shaped how the land was perceived. Memories of past accidents blended with stories of shadowy figures and unexplained sounds, creating a narrative where legend and history reinforced each other, deepening the site's aura of persistent unease. The site remains accessible yet forbidding, its quiet corners holding echoes of past tragedies that continue to unsettle those who wander among the ruins. Explorers report that the air feels heavier, that silence is punctuated by unaccountable noises, and that certain locations evoke visceral apprehension. The abandoned rides, benches, and pathways seem almost alive with memory, as though the land itself preserves the weight of sorrow that occurred there. Even photographs taken today occasionally show anomalies that cannot be explained, reinforcing the uneasy sense that Lake Shawnee is not simply a playground, but a repository of layered histories and lingering presences. At present, Lake Shawnee sits in patient silence, a playground where joy and grief entwine, and the past refuses to be laid to rest. Mattoon, Illinois, the Mad Gasser Panic. An unseen menace gripped Mattoon in the summer of 1944, sending residents scrambling from homes with strange sensations and fear that no one could fully explain. At first, the disturbances seemed isolated, faint, sweet odours that left people dizzy and lightheaded, but their persistence quickly drew attention. Doors were bolted, windows closed, and families whispered about invisible intrusions as tension built across neighbourhoods. The air seemed thick with suspicion, and every nightfall brought apprehension that another attack might occur. Despite the lack of a tangible culprit, the sense of danger was real, as though the town itself had become prey to an invisible predator. Panic spread faster than any news headline, and the mystery deepened with every account. Even pets reacted nervously, yelping or refusing to enter certain rooms, as if sensing the presence that humans could only describe in fragments. Wartime rationing, distant battles, and the hum of industry set the backdrop for a town already sensitive to rumours and disturbances. Citizens lived under the strain of global conflict while attempting to maintain normal routines in homes, factories, and shops. Tensions were heightened by shortages of goods, long work hours, and concern for loved ones serving overseas. This atmosphere magnified fear and anxiety, creating fertile ground for the rapid escalation of the Mad Gasser Panic. Even minor anomalies, unusual smells, unexplained dizziness, were interpreted as evidence of a lurking threat, blending real danger with collective unease. The town's psychology became as significant a factor as any physical occurrence. Whispers of hidden saboteurs travelled quickly, sometimes faster than the actual symptoms, feeding speculation at every corner. Neighbours described faint, sweet odours, accompanied by dizziness and nausea, each occurrence unsettling those who had previously felt safe in their homes. Some woke with trembling hands, dry mouths, and pounding hearts, unsure if illness or fear had overtaken them. Others recounted seeing shimmering haze or flickering lights along hallways and staircases, experiences that left them disoriented. Reports quickly multiplied, each retelling amplifying the perceived threat. Ordinary domestic spaces, bedrooms, kitchens, and living rooms became arenas of uncertainty. People no longer trusted that their homes offered protection, and the invisible intruder became a spectre woven into the fabric of daily life. Families experimented with masks, fans, and makeshift ventilation, but no method seemed to prevent the sensations, deepening their frustration and panic. Within weeks, dozens of households claimed exposure, creating an invisible threat that seemed to drift across streets and alleys with unpredictable timing. Some residents experienced simultaneous attacks in neighbouring houses, while others remained untouched, contributing to confusion about cause and pattern. The phenomenon was erratic. No one could predict when or where it might strike next. Children were kept indoors, errands were delayed, and nightly walks were abandoned as the community adapted to this unseen menace. Every sound and odour became a potential warning. The streets themselves, usually safe and familiar, seemed imbued with suspicion and threat, a network of invisible corridors where the gasser could strike at any moment. A quiet evening breeze could carry dread as easily as relief, leaving no simple way to discern safety from danger. Headlines described mystery gasser attacks, and journalists documented frightened residents, fueling concern while struggling to separate fact from hearsay. Local newspapers published vivid accounts of sudden illness and claimed sightings, often reproducing residents' own descriptions of sweet odours and fainting spells. Editors cautioned against panic even as their stories amplified public anxiety. Outside media took notice, framing Mattoon as a town gripped by inexplicable phenomena, while sceptical voices argued that sensationalism might worsen fear. These reports became part of the town's collective experience, embedding the panic into public consciousness, and making it nearly impossible to discern ordinary illness from imagined attack. Letters to editors, personal diaries, and town hall debates preserved both fact and speculation, creating a mosaic of uncertainty that lasted for months. Teams of local officials and visiting scientists canvassed homes, carried detection equipment, and collected samples, all searching for tangible evidence of a perpetrator. Chemical tests were conducted, windows inspected, and ventilation systems examined, yet the results were inconclusive. Some devices detected minor variations in air quality, but none indicated a purposeful release of gas. Observers recorded faint odours at times, yet environmental factors, heat, humidity, and local flora were often offered as explanations. Even the most methodical inquiries could not account for the experiences reported by residents. The uncertainty heightened tension. If experts could not explain it, then the phenomenon retained its power over the town. Many citizens doubted that science could ever truly reveal the truth, leaving them to navigate a world where logic seemed insufficient. Alternative explanations ranged from practical jokes to chemical leaks, while witness accounts often contradicted one another, deepening the enigma. Some suggested an eccentric neighbour or mischievous prankster, yet there was no evidence of tampering or chemical deployment. Others speculated that wartime fears had manifested in psychosomatic illness, creating symptoms where no agent existed. Debates unfolded in homes, stores, and council meetings, but consensus was elusive. Every contradictory account reinforced suspicion, as neighbours questioned whether friends and acquaintances might be unknowing participants in the events. Fear fed on uncertainty, and uncertainty fed on the town's inability to find a logical explanation. The absence of closure made the invisible threat feel permanent, as if it could emerge again at any moment. One resident recalled waking to an acrid smell, trembling limbs, and an oppressive sense of being watched, sensations that defied conventional explanation. Another described dizziness so severe that walking across a room felt impossible, yet found no physical cause. Children complained of nausea, adults of shortness of breath, and the elderly of sudden weakness. Each experience added to the town's narrative, creating a patchwork of fear that seemed coherent only in its inconsistency. The invisible nature of the attacks magnified their terror. There was no way to defend against a presence that could not be measured, observed, or captured. Some spoke of shadowy figures glimpsed at the edge of vision, though no one could confirm they existed, an uncertainty that left imagination to amplify the panic. Despite methodical testing, no source was confirmed, leaving both experts and locals puzzled by the persistent and mysterious occurrences. Exhaustive searches yielded no hidden chemicals, gas lines, or other evidence that could account for the sensations. Laboratories found no traces of toxic agents, yet symptoms continued to manifest. Physicians reported strange clusters of illness, often without fever or other signs of infection, suggesting a cause beyond ordinary disease. The town became a case study in the limits of observation, phenomena documented and experienced, yet impervious to traditional explanation. Some began to question whether the fear itself had become contagious, a shared hallucination fed by tension and expectation. Neighbourhoods remained tense, people avoided venturing out alone, and social routines adapted to a persistent but unseen fear that lingered in homes. Errands were done in pairs, windows were tightly shut, and social gatherings dwindled. Adults questioned their children's activities, and strangers were viewed with suspicion. The invisible nature of the phenomenon created an environment of hypervigilance, where every ordinary action was fraught with the possibility of exposure. Even mundane chores became exercises in caution, as the gasser, real or imagined, had shifted the town's rhythm and perception of safety. Residents recounted nights spent listening for faint hissing or sweet odours, a vigilance that often left them awake and anxious for hours. Over time, the panic became folklore, retold in family stories, newspaper archives, and historical accounts, cementing the mad gasser as a mysterious emblem of the era. Residents who had lived through the events spoke of them with a mixture of fear and disbelief, while younger generations absorbed the narrative as legend. Local historians documented incidents with care, noting both the verifiable effects and the social dynamics that fueled anxiety. The mad gasser panic became part of Mattoon's identity, a story that demonstrated the power of perception, rumour, and collective fear. It lingered in collective memory long after the tangible symptoms had faded, leaving a shadow of unease in town records and whispered recollections. Similar phantom gasser episodes appeared in other towns, yet Mattoon's panic stood out for its intensity, duration, and enduring uncertainty about what truly occurred. Comparable events in neighbouring regions were brief and less documented, leaving Mattoon as a unique example of widespread community hysteria intertwined with unverified phenomena. Scholars have analysed the events as an intersection of social tension, wartime anxiety, and environmental factors, yet the precise origin remains elusive. The town's experience stands as both a historical curiosity and a case study in human response to the inexplicable. Every detail, every testimony, every fleeting sensation adds to a story that defies closure, as though the fear itself refuses to be forgotten. Mattoon remains haunted not by what can be seen, but by the invisible presence that once left the entire town trembling in its shadow. Sodder Children. Mystery, Fayetteville, West Virginia. December evening settled quietly over Fayetteville, West Virginia, as the Sodder family carried out their final preparations for Christmas Eve, unaware of the calamity ahead. The home, a modest structure of wood and stone, was filled with warmth and the quiet energy of a family accustomed to its rhythms. Children moved between rooms, hanging ornaments with meticulous care, while the adults checked the stove, wrapped gifts, and arranged the table for the coming celebration. Outside, the chill of winter pressed against the windows, but inside, laughter and conversation masked the tension that would soon erupt into disaster. By nightfall, the ordinary had already begun to fracture in ways no one could foresee. The household hummed with routine. Children arranged ornaments, meals simmered on the stove, and laughter threaded through ordinary conversation. Silently, the family moved in coordinated patterns, each aware of the roles they played in maintaining the domestic order. George Sodder and his wife Jenny exchanged fleeting smiles as they supervised the younger children, ensuring everything was prepared for the evening's festivities. The girls practiced Christmas carols in the parlour, and the boys checked the lights and decorations, oblivious to the invisible threads of fate tightening around their home. Every detail seemed ordinary, yet the night held a shadow no one recognised. A sudden fire erupted in the rear of the house, consuming timber and possessions, while leaving the most crucial questions unanswered. Flames ignited near the kitchen area, spreading rapidly along dry boards and aged furniture. The source was likely an electrical fault, yet the blaze behaved inconsistently, sparing certain parts of the structure entirely. Smoke filled the rooms with alarming speed, and the crackle of fire became an audible signal of impending disaster. In the chaos, the children's whereabouts became uncertain, and by the time neighbours noticed the flames, 5 of the Sodder children had vanished from the house entirely. Flames moved unpredictably through the rooms, sparing some spaces entirely and reducing others to ash, forming a disturbing pattern. One parlour remained almost untouched, while adjacent bedrooms were blackened beyond recognition. Personal items, books, toys, clothing were partially destroyed, as if the fire had selectively chosen its targets. The uneven consumption of the house, combined with missing occupants, created an eerie atmosphere that confounded those first on the scene. Every detail of the fire suggested normal causes, yet the absence of the children defied logic and investigation, leaving a haunting impression on the family and the community alike. Relatives and neighbours rushed to the scene, combing the ruins for any trace of the missing children amid scorched furniture and debris. Smoke still rose in thin spirals as family members lifted burned beams and sifted through blackened remnants of everyday life. Volunteers called for caution, warning against moving unstable structures, yet desperation drove hands to search where danger waited. Despite their efforts, the remains of the children were nowhere to be found, leaving behind only fragments of possessions and the charred scent of an incomplete disaster. The scene became a tableau of absence, a haunting contrast to the warmth that had filled the house hours earlier. Unusual occurrences followed the blaze: vanished tools, mysterious phone calls, and fragments of belongings that seemed to disappear without explanation. Ladders and ropes left at the house for practical use were found missing the next morning. Telephone lines rang with messages that could not be traced, offering cryptic suggestions that someone had been watching. Letters arrived months later, hinting at sightings of children who bore the Sodder surname. Every unexplained event intensified the sense that the disappearance was not the result of fire alone, leaving unanswered questions that would follow the family for decades. Fire investigators and law enforcement examined the wreckage, yet each detail seemed to contradict the next, deepening the sense of uncertainty. The official report suggested an accidental fire caused by faulty wiring, yet no bodies were recovered to corroborate the theory. Inspectors noted inconsistencies in burn patterns, odd gaps where the children should have been, and unaccounted-for exits that could not be explained. While the family accepted the professionalism of the authorities, every finding seemed to reinforce the impossibility of the missing children simply perishing in the blaze. Evidence, or the lack thereof, became a haunting presence in its own right. Whispers moved through the small community, a mixture of sorrow and unease as people speculated about what might have occurred that night. Some recalled strange vehicles near the house in the hours before the fire, while others mentioned overheard arguments that may have hinted at motives beyond ordinary family disputes. Rumours were inconsistent and often contradictory, yet they underscored the reality that the disappearance had shaken the entire town. Fear mingled with sympathy, leaving a residue of suspicion that persisted long after the smoke cleared. The story became part of Fayetteville's collective consciousness, a riddle with no solution in sight. The Sodders worked to restore their home and lives, yet the absence of 5 children created a constant oppressive tension in every room. Rebuilding the house was a task undertaken with meticulous care, but each completed wall and polished floor could not erase the lingering void. Every holiday, every quiet evening, was a reminder of the unanswered questions that haunted the family. Jenny Sodder kept hope alive through subtle rituals, placing gifts, leaving lights burning, maintaining spaces that might welcome the children if they returned. Life continued, but the ordinary rhythms of family life were forever shadowed by uncertainty. Over the years, unverified sightings, cryptic letters, and ambiguous clues surfaced, each offering fleeting hope without resolving the enduring mystery. One letter, postmarked from across the country, claimed to have been written by one of the missing children, yet details could not be verified. Sightings were reported in distant states, always unconfirmed, and objects believed to belong to the children appeared unexpectedly in public spaces. Each anomaly hinted at survival, yet none provided definitive answers, leaving both family and investigators suspended in a state of continuous, unresolved tension. Photographs, newspaper archives, and family testimonies documented the incident, yet these records only seemed to underscore the unanswered questions. Images of the burned house captured a home almost destroyed, but in each frame the absence of bodies remained conspicuous. Newspaper reports recounted the tragedy with sympathetic detail, noting the missing children and the oddities surrounding the fire, yet no follow-up ever produced certainty. Histories of the event emphasized what was known while acknowledging the gaps, highlighting the delicate balance between fact and speculation. Researchers and amateur investigators revisited the case repeatedly, examining leads and testimonies, but no explanation fully accounted for the children's disappearance. Decades later, scholars have pored over fire reports, family accounts, and correspondence, attempting to reconcile every piece of information. None has reached a conclusion that satisfies both the evidence and the lingering doubts. Each inquiry highlights the limits of human understanding, as if the case itself resists finality, existing instead as an enduring puzzle for anyone who approaches it. Within Fayetteville and beyond, the story persists in conversations, folklore, and investigation, leaving the truth suspended in uncertainty. Parents warn children of the tragic night, historians record it as a cautionary tale, and true crime enthusiasts seek clues in old archives. Yet the central question, the fate of the 5 Sodder children, remains elusive. Every generation re-examines the evidence, and every retelling renews the tension, demonstrating how a single event can ripple across decades without ever fully resolving. The fate of the Sodder children remains a ghostly presence, hovering between reality and speculation, never fully revealed. Dudleytown, Connecticut, the village that vanished. Rumours spread quickly among neighbouring towns that something inexplicable had driven families from Dudleytown, leaving it empty almost overnight. The earliest settlers arrived in the mid-18th century, carving homesteads from thick forests and struggling to eke out a living from soil often described as uncooperative. Despite their efforts, misfortune seemed to cling to the settlement, and word of its hardships travelled quickly through surrounding communities. Historical accounts note that crops failed unexpectedly, livestock perished under unusual circumstances, and some settlers experienced illnesses that could not be easily explained. Even at the time, an unease hung over the village, drawing attention and speculation alike. Settlers struggled to maintain farms and homes, yet subtle signs of discord hint at tensions that historical records can only partially explain. Property disputes, disputes over water rights, and family feuds were documented sporadically, though gaps remain in surviving records. Letters suggest that disagreements were not solely practical but carried undertones of suspicion, resentment, and fear. Religious differences may have exacerbated these tensions, while the village's isolation prevented easy recourse or mediation. Combined with the hardships of frontier life, these social strains contributed to an atmosphere that neighbours described as oppressive. Observers noted that Dudleytown seemed haunted by an almost palpable sense of unease that seeped into the very fabric of daily life. Harvest failed repeatedly, and illness visited with a strange regularity, fueling speculation that the village's decline was more than ordinary misfortune. Official records document several families abandoning their farms in consecutive years, often leaving possessions behind. Contemporary newspapers occasionally mention Dudleytown in passing, describing it as a place where life was unexpectedly cruel. Though some losses could be attributed to poor soil or harsh winters, the consistency and severity of misfortune stood out compared with nearby settlements. Scholars examining these trends have highlighted the unusual concentration of accidents, illness, and crop failures, noting patterns that resist conventional agricultural or epidemiological explanations. Each disappearance of a family added to the village's growing reputation for misfortune. Diaries and letters reveal that villagers themselves feared an unseen force, a silent menace whispered about behind closed doors. A mid-19th century journal entry refers to a shadow that stalks the homes, while correspondence between families mentions sleepless nights and a growing dread. Even routine tasks like tending livestock or repairing fences were described with an air of apprehension, as if the landscape itself resisted human activity. Oral traditions collected in the early 20th century recount villagers avoiding particular areas or speaking in hushed tones about invisible threats. These first-hand accounts lend a human perspective to the unfolding mystery, highlighting the psychological weight of living under what was perceived as an ever-present, inexplicable menace. Visitors recount an uneasy feeling upon entering the area, a creeping dread that seemed to settle over the community long before abandonment. In the decades following the village's depopulation, Hikers and explorers noted sensations of vertigo or disorientation while walking the trails. Some described hearing footsteps when no one else was present, while others reported objects moving slightly or sounds carried by the wind that resembled voices. Scientific attempts to rationalize these experiences, from wind patterns to auditory illusions, failed to account for their consistency across different observers. The lingering atmosphere of tension and fear has persisted, suggesting that Dudleytown's reputation is not merely the product of rumour, but intertwined with the site's enduring psychological resonance. Strange occurrences were noted by those passing through. Inexplicable noises, vanished tools, and livestock behaving in ways that defied explanation. Accounts from early 20th century visitors describe small fires appearing spontaneously, or animals refusing to enter certain areas. Trees were said to fall without apparent cause, and the ground around abandoned homes sometimes appeared disturbed despite the absence of human activity. Local reports emphasized the eeriness of these events, noting that even skeptical outsiders left with a sense of discomfort. Though no single phenomenon can be confirmed conclusively, the cumulative effect of these reports deepened the impression that Dudleytown was more than just an ordinary deserted settlement. Land deeds and census documents indicate departures that make little chronological sense, leaving gaps in the historical record. While some families moved due to economic hardship or illness, other departures occurred abruptly with no formal sale or record of relocation. Descendants occasionally recounted that relatives simply vanished, leaving homes intact and belongings behind. Analysis of these anomalies has challenged historians seeking a linear narrative, revealing a complex mosaic of migration, disappearance, and abandonment. Each unexplained exit reinforced the village's mystique, as patterns emerged that could not be entirely attributed to practical or environmental factors. This irregular timeline contributes to the enduring puzzle surrounding Dudleytown's depopulation. Explorers of the ruins later described odd sensations, as if the village resisted observation, concealing what should have been plainly visible. Visitors consistently reported a subtle disorientation, sometimes feeling that paths had shifted or that familiar landmarks appeared altered. Photographs occasionally captured shadows or distortions not present to the naked eye, though these remained subject to interpretation. Several accounts describe the sensation of being watched or guided by an unseen presence, producing unease that intensified the further one ventured. These phenomena, while anecdotal, recur frequently enough to suggest a psychological or environmental component worth noting. The village, though deserted, maintained a sense of active presence that defied easy explanation. Tales told by outsiders and descendants mixed fact with rumour, producing a folklore of curses intertwined with real misfortune. Local historians document stories of ancestral curses, ill-fated families, and spectral apparitions that grew in prominence during the 19th and 20th centuries. Oral traditions often describe villagers avoiding specific locations, hearing phantom voices, or sensing malevolent intent. While some accounts may have been embellished over time, the convergence of folklore and documented hardship suggests that legend and lived experience reinforced one another. This blend of narrative strands complicates efforts to separate myth from reality, yet it also enriches the village's mysterious character and explains why it continues to fascinate researchers. Theories proposed over the decades, from soil depletion to psychological strain, explain some outcomes but leave the core mystery unresolved. Scholars examining land quality, crop patterns, and climatic data provide plausible explanations for the partial decline. Sociologists point to isolation and social pressures as contributing factors to mental strain and migration. Yet no single hypothesis accounts for the simultaneous occurrences of illness, familial disappearances, and the reported inexplicable phenomena. The inability to conclusively reconcile these disparate factors sustains the sense of ambiguity, leaving Dudleytown perched between historical record and legend. This persistent uncertainty ensures that the village remains a subject of speculation and inquiry. Objects left behind, from household items to personal effects, hint at lives interrupted without warning or apparent reason. Furniture remains overturned, tools lie scattered, and letters remain tucked in drawers, seemingly abandoned mid-task. These relics offer clues to the daily routines of the villagers, but also emphasize the abruptness of their departure. Anthropologists and historians studying these artifacts Note the incongruity between care in daily life and sudden abandonment, reinforcing the eerie narrative of a settlement emptied under unknown pressures. The tangible remnants of human activity contrast sharply with the village's desolation, inviting reflection on the fragility of communities confronted by both natural and inexplicable forces. Over time, Dudleytown inspired articles, essays, and ghost stories, each retelling shaping the village's reputation as a place of enigma. Newspapers in the 20th century described it as Connecticut's cursed village, while local authors contributed accounts blending historical fact with the supernatural. Academic studies examined migration records and environmental factors, while folklore collections preserved oral histories of fear and disappearance. These layers of narrative, both factual and anecdotal, have contributed to a cumulative sense of mystery that persists in contemporary imagination. The interplay between documented events and legend ensures that Dudleytown remains a subject of intrigue for scholars, explorers, and paranormal enthusiasts alike. Scholars and thrill-seekers alike return to its remnants, drawn by a sense that the village's history refuses to remain buried. Expeditions continue to chart the ruins, map trails, and document atmospheric anomalies, yet each investigation raises new questions. Visitors often leave with impressions of unease, unable to reconcile the tangible evidence with the pervasive stories of misfortune and disappearance. Even modern surveys employing technology and scientific methods fail to provide a definitive account of what transpired. The village resists complete understanding, challenging anyone who attempts to impose a neat explanation on its tangled history. Dudleytown's enigmatic aura remains a compelling and unresolved enigma. Even centuries later, Dudleytown endures as a ghostly enigma, a place where human presence has vanished, but questions remain. Bennington, Vermont, the town where people disappeared. Shadows pooled in the corners of quiet streets as unexplained absences began unsettling residents. The town of Bennington, nestled in southwestern Vermont, seemed ordinary at first glance. Farmlands stretching along gentle hills, a town square lined with brick storefronts, and roads weaving past centuries-old homes. Yet beneath this bucolic exterior, a series of disappearances haunted the community, leaving questions that would linger for decades. People went missing during simple routines, trips to the market, walks along the river, or chores on isolated farms. With each disappearance, unease deepened, and the town's rhythm began to shift in imperceptible ways. Authorities recorded the events meticulously, but the facts alone could not explain the dread settling over the residents. Each new absence felt heavier than the last, pressing against the collective consciousness of a community unable to understand what was happening. Hillsides folded into one another, concealing narrow lanes and isolated homesteads, where movement could vanish without notice. The geography of Bennington offered both beauty and peril. Dense woods rose abruptly from open fields, and fog could settle in valleys before sunrise, obscuring paths and erasing signs of human passage. Trails often ended at rivers or steep inclines, and it was not unusual for an unmarked path to disappear entirely into dense foliage. For newcomers, the terrain seemed idyllic. For locals, it became an almost sinister stage, the backdrop to events that defied reason. The natural isolation of certain areas allowed the missing to vanish without leaving evidence, and the topography itself seemed to amplify the town's growing sense of unease. Residents learned to navigate cautiously, noting which paths led to familiar clearings and which seemed to invite vanishing. Local records indicate that individuals vanished while performing ordinary tasks, leaving objects behind but no trace of themselves. One farmer went to check a fence line and never returned. His horse wandered back alone. A child sent to fetch water did not come home, leaving only a bucket in the grass. Personal belongings, boots, jackets, tools, remained scattered, sometimes near a trail, sometimes inexplicably placed on doorsteps or in fields. The suddenness of these disappearances was disorienting. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, and no witnesses. Each case added a layer of mystery that compounded with the next, forming an invisible web of unanswered questions spanning years. Certain consistencies emerged over time. Victims were alone, often near water or forest edges, and disappeared during transitional light. Evening and early morning were particularly dangerous. Some vanished while walking along the West River, or meandering through backwoods trails that locals had known for generations. Those who disappeared had nothing overtly in common. Age, gender, and occupation varied widely, yet the geographic and temporal patterns suggested some unseen force or unseen hazard influenced the events. Residents began to map these occurrences informally, noting that specific hollows, wooded slopes, and riverside clearings seemed especially dangerous. Even those with no interest in superstition began speaking in hushed tones about areas that didn't feel right. Rumours circulated at market stalls and along fences, prompting people to adjust routines and avoid specific areas entirely. Mothers kept children close, neighbours travelled in groups, and errands were postponed until daylight. The town's public spaces began to feel smaller and more controlled, as if fear had reshaped the familiar. Conversations often turned to speculation about causes, with whispers of invisible dangers or malevolent presences. Some claimed the disappearances were linked to the old iron mines on the hills, while others imagined more fantastical explanations, like spirits of the land exacting unknown justice. Whatever the cause, life in Bennington became defined by caution and observation as residents tried to coexist with the unknown. Officers and volunteers meticulously mapped paths, recovered scattered items, and recorded details that provided tantalizing hints without solutions. Law enforcement faced immense frustration. Evidence yielded few leads. Footprints often led to sudden dead ends in undergrowth or riverbanks. Notes, diaries, and personal effects gave glimpses of daily life, but no insight into the disappearance causes. Search parties returned repeatedly to the same areas, sometimes discovering new clues but never a resolution. Over time, frustration mingled with fear, creating tension within a town already tightly knit and deeply suspicious. Official reports grew increasingly detailed, yet offered only more questions than answers. A handful of residents reported fleeting glimpses of movement in the woods, or the faint echo of voices across empty fields. Some swore they saw figures vanish between trees without a trace. Others described hearing cries that seemed impossibly distant or distorted. These accounts were sporadic and contradictory, offering tantalizing but frustrating evidence. The strange observations intensified the mystery, leaving residents to wonder if the events were natural or something else entirely. Each story fed the collective unease, as even the most skeptical townspeople found themselves questioning what they had seen or heard. Analysts proposed environmental hazards, transient criminals, or collective anxiety, yet none fully explained the timing or locations of the disappearances. Scientific explanations like sudden sinkholes, wildlife attacks, or toxic emissions from the hills were considered but failed to account for all incidents. Criminal activity remained a possibility, though the lack of signs of abduction or robbery confounded investigators. Psychologists suggested mass hysteria or heightened fear influencing perceptions, yet the disappearances occurred over decades and across generations, defying any simple social explanation. Each theory illuminated part of the puzzle, but the town's pattern of vanishings remained unresolved. Older townspeople whispered of restless spirits, unseen presences, and centuries-old curses haunting the Vermont hills. Folklore mingled with fact, shaping the town's collective imagination. Tales of colonial-era tragedies, battles, and lost wanderers became intertwined with contemporary disappearances. Some warned that the hills themselves were imbued with an ancient, watchful presence. Whether superstition or memory, these stories offered a framework for residents to discuss the unexplainable, giving voice to the anxieties otherwise impossible to express. Attendance dwindled at schools and communal events, and residents increasingly avoided isolated areas where the missing had last been seen. Social life retracted, and community gatherings shifted towards safer, central locations. Playgrounds, riverbanks, and hiking trails that once drew families now carried an unspoken warning. Even children learned the boundaries of what was safe and what was not, internalizing the caution passed down by parents. The town's everyday rhythm became a choreography of avoidance, each step dictated by unseen patterns of past events. Recent studies revisited old case files, cross-referencing maps, diaries, and witness statements, uncovering patterns that still defy explanation. Researchers examined distances between disappearances, correlations with geographic features, and recurring timelines. Despite careful analysis, no causal mechanism emerged. New questions arose. Were some disappearances connected in ways undetectable by modern methods? Did the landscape itself play a role? Modern technology offered tools that previous investigators lacked, but the ultimate mystery remained intact, leaving Bennington just as enigmatic as decades prior. Trails, clearings, and wooded slopes retain an eerie stillness, suggesting the hills themselves have preserved memories of those who vanished. Those who traverse the backwoods often report inexplicable sensations, the feeling of being watched, sudden chills, and glimpses of movement where nothing should be. Abandoned cabins and overgrown paths seem to exist in their own temporal rhythm, untouched by the passage of ordinary time. Even the wind through the trees sometimes carries faint, indistinct sounds that echo in ways that cannot be explained. The natural beauty of the area masks a persistent, silent presence tied to the disappearances. Curiosity draws outsiders, writers, and historians to Bennington, where unanswered questions linger in every shadow and hollow. Each visitor approaches the town cautiously, aware of the disappearances that define its reputation. Scholars, journalists, and paranormal enthusiasts alike attempt to make sense of the events, sometimes retracing paths where individuals vanished. Maps are marked, diaries consulted, and photographs studied for anomalies that might provide a clue. Despite all attention, Bennington holds its secrets tightly, offering glimpses of mystery without resolution. The vanished remain unclaimed by time, their absence stitched into the land, whispering enigmas that no one has yet unraveled. Portlock, Alaska, the village that fled. Portlock, Alaska, sits on the jagged edge of the Alaska Peninsula, a village once alive with the rhythms of fishing, trapping, and close-knit survival, now swallowed by silence and decay. Its residents, a mixture of Alaska natives and settlers, lived at the mercy of the land and sea, following salmon runs and sea otter migrations with meticulous timing. In the mid-20th century, however, this balance was shattered. A wave of unexplained deaths, strange illnesses, and ominous reports from the surrounding wilderness began to unsettle the community, eventually prompting its complete abandonment. Those who remained during the first wave of misfortune spoke of an intangible menace lurking beyond the tree line. Hunters returning from the spruce forests described feeling watched, hearing footsteps where none should exist, and seeing wolves behave with unusual aggression and precision. Fishing boats often returned empty despite fertile waters, and traps set for otters went untouched. Smoke from chimneys diminished and vanished as families hesitated to cook their meals, unnerved by a pervasive dread that settled over the village like an invisible fog. The documented illnesses began in the late 1940s. Residents suffered high fevers, bleeding gums, disorientation, and sudden weakness, often succumbing in a matter of days. While influenza and tuberculosis were initially suspected, medical examinations revealed inconsistencies with known diseases. Local doctors were powerless, and patients sometimes died before treatment could even begin. Anthropologists later speculated environmental causes, perhaps contamination from nearby cannery operations, but no conclusive evidence was ever recorded. For many, fear eclipsed reason, and families decided it was safer to leave than remain and face unknown dangers. Portlock's geographic isolation only amplified its vulnerability. Accessible solely by small boat or plane, its residents relied heavily on one another for survival during brutal winters. Supplies and mail arrived sporadically, and the village had no permanent medical facility. As the pattern of illness and death continued, residents became trapped in a feedback loop of fear. The more they feared the land, the more precarious their existence became. By the 1960s, the majority had fled, leaving only a handful of elders to witness the slow, inevitable decay of their homes and the disappearance of a community they had built over generations. The wilderness surrounding Portlock appeared to resist human habitation. Dense forests overtook trails within months, and storm-swept coastlines altered the village's contours unpredictably. Anthropologists and folklorists note that stories of spirits or land reactions were common among the few remaining residents. While some dismiss these accounts as psychological effects of isolation, the consistency of the narratives across decades, from villagers to Coast Guard personnel, suggests that something unusual, if intangible, shaped the community's perception of danger. Even after the village emptied, evidence of life lingered in unsettling ways. Abandoned fishing boats sit half-submerged in shallow bays, nets tangled and rotting. Foundations crumble beneath moss, and scattered personal items, photographs, canned goods, worn clothing, remain as if their owners might return at any moment. Visitors to the site today report a heaviness in the air, a quiet that feels deliberate rather than natural, a lingering awareness that the land itself remembers the abrupt departure. Some travellers have noted that at dusk the forest seems to whisper, though no wind moves the branches. Historical documents hint at other contributing factors. Some accounts reference unusual animal behaviour, sled dogs disappearing without a trace, bears appearing unusually close to settlements, and migratory birds avoiding the area entirely. Oral histories describe nights filled with strange sounds, howls, whispers, and unidentifiable cries emanating from the forest. Coast Guard reports from the 1960s mention passing fishermen noting a faint, persistent odour near the shore, unexplained and never investigated in depth. A few explorers claimed they could see shadows moving behind the trees at twilight, though no human presence was evident. While modern researchers attempt to rationalise these events as environmental anomalies, no combination of known factors fully explains the psychological and physical toll on the residents. In the broader context of Alaskan history, Portlock stands apart. The state is accustomed to harsh conditions, yet few other settlements have experienced a sudden and total abandonment fueled by both documented illness and widespread fear. Scholars have compared Portlock to ghost towns left after economic collapse, yet this community vanished without warning, leaving livelihoods, homes, and decades of carefully built routines behind. The scale and abruptness of the exodus remain unusual, even by Alaskan standards. Some historians suggest that cultural knowledge of previous epidemics in Alaska might have amplified collective fear, creating a psychic weight that made leaving feel urgent. The few who remained after the mass departure tell fragmented stories of the village's final days. Some mention funerals conducted in haste, graves left unmarked, and possessions stacked and abandoned. Others recall moments of sheer terror in the forests, instances where familiar paths became disorienting or seemed to move themselves. Letters and journals preserved in state archives provide glimpses of daily life under a growing shadow, capturing the tension that eventually overwhelmed reason and routine. Descriptions of cold mornings filled with inexplicable moaning sounds from the hills add to the sense of an unseen presence intruding on everyday life. Environmental studies conducted decades later reveal no definitive cause for the illnesses, though researchers acknowledge that the combination of harsh weather, limited medical access, and potential contaminants could have played a role. Yet, these explanations fail to account for the extraordinary behavioural responses of the villagers, the suddenness of the flight, and the uncanny animal activity reported both before and after the departures. Even soil and water tests conducted in the 1970s yielded no anomalies sufficient to explain the collective fear and deaths, leaving the village's mystery intact. Portlock has inspired documentaries, investigative articles, and expeditions, yet every visitor confronts the same mystery. The village exists both as a physical site and a lingering question. Its skeletal structures, decayed boats, and scattered artifacts act as reminders of lives interrupted, histories left incomplete, and fears that cannot be fully quantified. Researchers note a pattern of abandoned settlements across Alaska, yet Portlock remains singular for the depth of terror and suddenness that prompted its total evacuation. Locals still refer to the place cautiously, some avoiding it entirely, and legends speak of faint lights or figures glimpsed across the frozen bay on clear nights. Even today, satellite images and surveys confirm that the land is slowly reclaiming what human hands once shaped, yet nothing stirs in the remnants. Trees have grown through floors, waves lap over once thriving docks, and wind scours the open windows of abandoned homes. Scholars and curious travellers alike are drawn by the allure of an unresolved tragedy, a village emptied not by economic hardship alone, but by forces that defy understanding and evade documentation. Every detail uncovered only deepens the tension between what is known and what seems impossible to explain. Portlock, Alaska, remains a place of absence and unanswered questions, where the land, the sea, and the memory of sudden flight converge into a silence that speaks louder than any record ever could. Cropsy's Shadow, Staten Island, New York. The streets of Staten Island appear ordinary by day, lined with modest homes and playgrounds, Yet beneath this suburban calm lies a history of whispered warnings and vanished children. In the mid-20th century, the borough became the setting for an unsettling blend of legend and tragedy. Residents spoke in quiet tones of Cropsy, a figure said to stalk the shadows near abandoned lots and overgrown forests. What began as childhood tales gradually merged with real events, shaping a narrative that unsettled the community and left an indelible mark on local memory. Tales of Cropsy began in hushed tones among local children, stories of a man who prowled the woods and vacant lots, a spectre that transformed ordinary afternoons into exercises in fear. Playground games were shadowed by warnings: do not linger after dark, do not wander near the old school grounds, and above all, beware the figure that could appear without notice. Parents initially dismissed these stories as youthful imagination, yet the consistency of the warnings, repeated across neighbourhoods, suggested a collective unease rooted in more than fantasy. Willowbrook State School, once heralded as a model institution for children with disabilities, became notorious for overcrowding, neglect and systemic abuse. Photographs and reports from the 1960s and 1970s document the facility's deteriorating conditions, peeling paint, cramped dormitories and understaffed wards. Accounts from staff and visitors describe an oppressive atmosphere that left residents isolated and vulnerable, their plight often invisible to the outside world. This environment, combined with the community's proximity to the institution, fed the fertile imagination of local children and adults alike, laying the groundwork for the Cropsy legend. In the 1970s and 1980s, disappearances of children from Staten Island neighbourhoods and nearby areas added grim context to the folklore. Local newspapers reported abductions, some linked years later to Andre Rand, a janitor and handyman with documented ties to Willowbrook. Families described unexplained absences, sometimes preceded by odd phone calls or glimpses of a shadowy figure near empty lots. Though not every disappearance could be traced to Rand, the incidents reinforced the notion that Cropsy was not merely a story but a lurking threat, capable of crossing from myth into real danger. The urban landscape itself seemed complicit, with fenced-off lots, shadowed alleyways and dense thickets where sunlight scarcely reached, turning familiar routes into treacherous paths for anyone wandering alone. Abandoned school buildings and defunct municipal facilities became focal points of fear, their empty corridors echoing with imagined footsteps. Even well-trodden sidewalks acquired a menacing quality after dusk, as the combination of shadows, overgrown vegetation, and the knowledge of past abductions lent the ordinary a sense of latent danger. Andre Rand, later convicted for multiple abductions and linked to the disappearance of several children, cast a tangible presence on these fears. Investigators traced his movements across Staten Island, noting his connection to Willowbrook and nearby forested areas. His crimes blurred the boundary between legend and reality, providing a grim explanation for the persistent stories of Cropsy. Yet even with convictions, the shadow he cast endured in the imagination of the community, amplified by the physical spaces that remained reminders of vanished children and abandoned institutions. Parents and neighbours altered their routines, escorting children to school and avoiding darkened corners, yet the legend persisted, gaining momentum even as authorities investigated the crimes that inspired it. Community meetings, police advisories, and media reports could not quell the undercurrent of fear. Playground conversations continued to include warnings, whispered instructions, and unspoken acknowledgement of dangers that adults sometimes hesitated to explain fully. In this atmosphere, urban legend became both shield and terror, guiding behaviour while keeping the mind alert to possibilities beyond comprehension. Over decades, Cropsy's image endured in recollections, media coverage, and documentaries, a figure that transcended individual crimes to become a lasting symbol of suburban dread. True crime reports and investigative journalism explored the intersection of folklore and criminal acts, highlighting how children's fears were amplified by very real threats. Local authors and historians documented the stories, noting that the legend's persistence was intertwined with the borough's physical environment, its abandoned buildings, thick woods, and isolated streets, each contributing to the aura of menace. Rusted swings sway in empty parks, corridors echo with footsteps long silenced, and peeling paint marks walls where children once played, all remnants of spaces that seem to remember their own histories of terror. Observers recount the odd sensation of being watched, and photographs of abandoned lots and decrepit schools reveal angles of shadow that suggest more than architectural decay. The sensory detail of these spaces, the metallic smell of rust, the muffled sound of distant traffic, the dampness of neglected playgrounds, heightens the sense that these locations retain memories of fear, waiting for witnesses to stumble across them. The legend and the facts merged in unsettling ways, creating a narrative impossible to untangle. Playground fears intertwined with real abductions, each reinforcing the other in the collective memory. Researchers note that children's imaginations and adult anxieties were mutually reinforcing, particularly in neighbourhoods surrounding Willowbrook. Oral histories capture the same motif repeated across decades: a figure with an indistinct face, lurking near overgrown lots, capable of appearing without warning. The uncertainty of the legend allowed it to expand, persisting even when confirmed crimes were investigated and resolved. Investigations eventually revealed the final cases tied to Andre Rand, yet the shadows of uncertainty remained, and questions about vanished children and unexplored locales lingered long after the headlines faded. Case files described meticulous methods for luring victims, yet some disappearances remained unsolved. The coexistence of known crimes and persistent myth created a dual narrative, a documented horror grounded in law enforcement and an enduring psychological terror that haunted families, neighbourhoods, and anyone who dared venture near the spaces linked to Cropsy. Today, visitors to Staten Island's forgotten corners encounter a silence that feels deliberate, as though the streets themselves hold on to memories no one dares to confront. Abandoned lots, fenced-off ruins, and forested edges of neighbourhoods retain a quiet tension, as if time itself hesitates before passing through these places. Even decades after the last documented abduction, the borough retains an invisible pulse of unease, where the past continues to intersect with the present, and where folklore and reality remain inseparable in the shadows. Even in the quietest neighbourhoods, where the sun falls evenly across lawns and streets, the memory of Cropsy lingers, a shadow that refuses to be fully seen or understood. The Radium Girls, Ottawa, Illinois. The faint, ghostly glow of radium cast an otherworldly light across the work tables, illuminating the delicate hands of young women as they traced tiny numbers on watch dials. Each stroke seemed precise, almost ceremonial, yet with every brush point, minute particles of the luminous element entered their lips and skin, invisible and insidious. The factories hummed with industry, the rhythmic clatter of machinery blending with the soft scratch of brushes on enamel. In this ordinary, bustling environment, a silent menace began to take hold, imperceptible to sight, smell, or touch, leaving behind a trail of illness that no one could yet explain. Radium had arrived in Ottawa as a marvel, a symbol of modernity and progress. Its discovery sparked fascination across the nation, promising medical breakthroughs, luminous watches, and glowing advertisements that seemed to defy the ordinary. Factory owners eagerly embraced the substance, envisioning prosperity in every glowing dial and medical product. Workers were recruited to shape and paint the radium onto tiny numbers and hands, a seemingly benign task that nonetheless carried a silent hazard. The town itself seemed bathed in promise, unaware that the brilliance celebrated on factory floors concealed a hazard that would quietly devastate the women who handled it daily. The young women who laboured in these factories were often teenagers or in their early 20s, drawn by the allure of steady wages and the pride of skilled work. They leaned over their dials for hours at a time, lips touching brushes in the lip-pointing technique, their eyes focused on the delicate curves of numerals that would glow for decades. The rhythmic motion became hypnotic, almost ritualistic, each stroke seemingly harmless yet a subtle act of self-poisoning. The glow of radium reflected on their faces like a silent witness, beautiful and mesmerizing, masking the invisible damage it inflicted with every application. Early signs of illness were subtle, often dismissed as minor complaints. Fatigue, aching jaws, and loose teeth were attributed to ordinary conditions, exhaustion, poor diet, or dental issues. Families grew concerned as symptoms progressed, yet doctors struggled to identify a cause. Slowly, patterns emerged. Women in the same factory, performing the same tasks, developing identical ailments. The gradual nature of the affliction heightened the mystery, leaving sufferers frustrated and frightened. and creating tension between the perception of harmless work and the invisible hazard that was steadily consuming their bodies from within. Medical professionals began documenting these anomalies with increasing concern. Jaw necrosis, brittle bones, and anemia were recorded in clinical notes, yet physicians initially struggled to connect the cases to radium exposure. Investigations revealed inconsistencies in tissue and blood chemistry, confounding understanding and amplifying the sense of unease. Families watched helplessly as young women endured pain that defied explanation. Each new case strengthened the eerie realization that a hidden, silent force had taken residence in their town, one that transformed routine labor into a slow, devastating ordeal no one could see until it was too late. Radium's effects were invisible yet relentless, penetrating bone and tissue with deadly precision. Unlike conventional poisons, its presence could not be detected through smell, taste, or sight. The very brilliance that made the substance desirable, its glowing, almost ethereal quality, belied its capacity for destruction. Timepieces gleamed, advertisements shimmered, and the factory seemed alive with progress. Yet beneath the glow, the women's bodies were succumbing to radiation that would slowly erode their skeletal structure, damage their marrow, and hollow out their lives with an imperceptible but inexorable force. Supervisors and factory managers offered reassurances while the women's suffering escalated. Complaints were downplayed, symptoms attributed to imagination or minor ailments. Economic pressure and the town's reliance on industrial output created a subtle but persistent tension between ambition and human cost. Workers feared for their health, but also for their livelihoods, trapped in a system that celebrated productivity while minimizing danger. Families urged caution, yet the cultural trust in innovation and the promise of progress muted alarm, leaving the women caught between duty, desire, and the creeping realization of a hidden hazard that could not be escaped by leaving the factory floor. As public scrutiny grew, lawsuits were filed, exposing corporate denial and systemic negligence. Investigative journalists documented the link between radium exposure and the women's illnesses, revealing a tragedy that had unfolded quietly for years. Courtrooms became arenas where fact clashed with corporate interests, and the full scope of the disaster emerged in painstaking detail. Slowly, Ottawa became the centre of national attention, not for its prosperity or innovation, but for the quiet horror that had been woven into the very fabric of its industry, challenging assumptions about safety, progress, and the invisible dangers lurking behind modern marvels. The personal toll was devastating. Necrotic jaws, fractured and crumbling bones, chronic anemia, and early deaths marked the suffering of the Radium Girls. Each case told a story of labour transformed into tragedy, of brilliance turned lethal. Families bore witness to anguish that was slow and silent, leaving psychological scars alongside the physical devastation. The women's resilience and courage, however, became integral to the eventual recognition of their plight, transforming individual suffering into a catalyst for broader awareness, legal reform, and lasting lessons about industrial responsibility and the human cost of unchecked technological progress. The tragedy reshaped the regulatory landscape, catalysing reforms in workplace safety and labour law. Factories were compelled to reconsider the handling of toxic substances, medical oversight was strengthened, and the plight of the Radium Girls became a case study in industrial ethics. Yet even as laws changed, the lingering shadow of the tragedy remained embedded in Ottawa's identity. The physical and psychological aftermath endured in the community, and the invisible menace of radium served as a haunting reminder that progress, when unchecked and unmonitored, could conceal hazards far more insidious than any visible danger. Traces of the ordeal are still present in Ottawa: abandoned factories, archival photographs, and the recollections of surviving families. Soil studies occasionally reveal residual radiation, while oral histories recount the suffering endured in silence. The town itself carries an invisible weight, a collective memory of brilliance intertwined with danger, of innovation shadowed by unforeseen consequences. These remnants serve as both a warning and a testimony to the resilience of those who endured the ordeal, and to the slow, unrelenting influence of forces that could neither be seen nor fully understood until it was too late. Radium remains a paradox, radiant and captivating yet quietly lethal. Its story intertwines with human ambition, scientific curiosity, and industrial oversight, creating a legacy of both wonder and horror. The women of Ottawa became unwilling pioneers in understanding invisible hazards, their suffering forging changes that extended far beyond the town. History remembers the glow, the innovation, and the tragedy, a reminder that brilliance can mask destruction, and that progress is inseparable from the risk it often conceals. Even now, in the quiet remnants of those factories, the faint glow of radium whispers of brilliance turned silently fatal. Bath, Michigan, the schoolhouse disaster. Mornings in Bath often began with a quiet stillness, broken only by the faint murmur of children arriving at school and the distant whistle of trains crossing the town. The streets were lined with modest homes, small shops, and the occasional church spire catching the early light, giving the impression of a peaceful, orderly community. On January 18th, 1927, the day began like any other. Children wrapped in coats and scarves, carrying lunch pails, laughter spilling into the cold winter air. Yet beneath the routine rhythm of school life, a hidden calamity waited, one that would shatter the town's sense of safety in an instant. The air itself seemed ordinary, but the faint smell of coal smoke mixed with winter frost hinted at the ordinary world poised on the edge of disaster. Inside the schoolhouse, the wooden floors creaked beneath the careful footsteps of teachers and staff, every desk and chalkboard arranged with precise attention to daily instruction. The principal oversaw the orderly movement of students between classrooms, while janitors swept corridors and maintained the warmth of the coal stoves. On the surface, it was ordinary, a space of learning and discipline, familiar and predictable. Yet the very structure that housed this normalcy contained elements of risk that would be tragically revealed within hours, as the building itself became the stage for a catastrophe no one had anticipated. Even the shadows cast by early sunlight through frosted windows seemed heavier that morning, as though anticipating the day's unseen peril. Children filled the rooms with laughter and energy, their voices blending with the scratch of chalk and the rustle of papers. They recited lessons, practiced arithmetic, and whispered secret jokes to one another, oblivious to the latent danger in their midst. Teachers moved from desk to desk, correcting spelling errors and encouraging progress, unaware that the ordinary hum of learning would soon be violently interrupted. The juxtaposition of innocence and lurking peril created a tension that would become all too real, as the mundane routines of a school day would be instantly transformed into a tableau of chaos and fear. Even small details, the glint of sunlight on a student's pencil or the scrape of a chair against the floor, would be frozen forever in the memory of those who survived. In a storage room not far from the classrooms, crates of nitroglycerin and other explosives waited. The chemicals were remnants from construction and agricultural operations, stored as a precaution but poorly secured by contemporary standards. To the adults responsible, these materials were simply a part of everyday industrial life, tools to be handled with caution, nothing more. Yet their proximity to the school's hallways and rooms made them an unpredictable threat. The very presence of these volatile substances, hidden in plain sight, would soon demonstrate how ordinary negligence could escalate into unimaginable tragedy. The small labels on the crates, almost ignored, marked the potential for devastation that no one could fully grasp. Subtle warning signs went unnoticed. A faint chemical odour occasionally lingered in the storage room, and the slightest vibrations from passing trains or nearby machinery could have shifted unstable containers. No one questioned the arrangement, nor the potential hazards of storing explosive materials adjacent to classrooms filled with children. In hindsight, these seemingly minor details were ominous clues, tiny threads that, when combined, would unravel into disaster. Even the sound of a distant hammer or the creak of a floorboard could have foretold the violence to come, though it passed without notice. The first explosion ripped through the building with unimaginable force. Windows shattered outward, walls buckled, and the air was filled with dust, debris, and the acrid tang of blown chemicals. The sudden violence transformed the familiar interior of the school into a landscape of terror. Desks were overturned, textbooks scattered, and the warmth of the classrooms was replaced by freezing air laced with smoke. The sound of the blast reverberated through the town, drawing neighbours to the scene even as the chaos continued to unfold inside the crumbling structure. Even now, survivors would recall how the window's glass exploded in a cascade, a deadly shimmer that seemed almost suspended in mid-air. Inside the classrooms, the teacher's voice was silenced mid-sentence, and children's laughter gave way to screams. Many were thrown to the floor, trapped beneath debris or struck by flying fragments of wood and glass. Some instinctively sheltered beneath desks, while others ran blindly toward exits blocked by collapsed walls. The suddenness of the explosion left no time for comprehension, only instinctual reactions. A terrifying dance of survival played out in the moments before first responders could arrive. The chaos mingled with confusion as dust and smoke obscured vision, creating a nightmare in which every movement carried risk. Neighbours and townspeople rushed toward the smoke and dust, arriving amid wreckage and uncertainty. Parents tore through snow-covered streets, drawn by distant screams and the shattering echo of destruction. Firefighters and police arrived quickly, but the full scale of devastation was immediately apparent. The school was partially destroyed. Cries for help pierced the cold winter air, and dust hung in ghostly clouds above the ruins. Amid the frantic rescue efforts, a strange and unsettling quiet persisted between bursts of activity, a stark contrast that heightened the tension and sense of helplessness. Even the wagons and sleds used to carry the injured seemed inadequate, a reminder of how unprepared the town was for such a sudden catastrophe. Casualties mounted rapidly. Dozens of children were injured, some fatally, alongside teachers and staff. Families were engulfed by grief and shock, many unable to comprehend the sudden loss and destruction. The scale of the disaster transformed the town's normal rhythms. Workplaces closed, shops shuttered, and the community gathered near the site, some assisting with recovery, while others stood in disbelief. Every face reflected horror, confusion, and the haunting realization that the lives of their children had been forever altered in mere seconds. Even small details, a fallen hat, a dropped lunch pail, served as silent reminders of the lives interrupted in an instant. Investigators later pieced together the sequence of events, identifying the unstable explosives in the storage room as the catalyst. Safety oversights, lack of secure storage, and proximity to classrooms were documented, revealing a chain of preventable mistakes that had transformed a routine school day into a national tragedy. These findings informed future regulations, emphasizing the dangers of combining educational spaces with industrial hazards. The disaster became a case study in risk management, illustrating how ordinary spaces can conceal extraordinary danger. Scholars noted that the lessons of Bath would ripple far beyond Michigan, influencing school safety for decades. The memory of that morning lingered in Bath for decades. Survivors, families, and townspeople carried the psychological weight of sudden loss, while the rebuilt school stood as both a functional space and a silent monument to the fragility of everyday life. Newspapers and archival records preserved the event for historians, educators, and policymakers, ensuring that the lessons of January 18, 1927 were neither forgotten nor repeated. The town, though resilient, remained shadowed by the sudden intrusion of death into a space that had once been safe, a reminder that ordinary routines could mask extraordinary peril. The quiet streets seemed forever haunted, every winter morning whispering memories of that day. Even as regulations improved and buildings were repaired or replaced, the legacy of fear and fragility persisted. Generations grew up hearing stories of that morning, the echo of screams and collapsing walls forming a quiet, omnipresent backdrop to the community's collective memory. The disaster became a defining moment in Bath's history, shaping the town's identity and embedding a sense of caution into its cultural consciousness. Safety became a tangible priority, but so too did the eerie recognition that tragedy often arrives without warning, leaving indelible marks on both place and memory. Long after the rubble was cleared, Bath remained haunted by the echo of screams, a town marked by the fragile boundary between safety and disaster. The lost colony of Roanoke, Manteo, North Carolina. Tides whispered against the shoreline, carrying with them the weight of centuries-old uncertainty and a secret no one had yet deciphered. The marshes and inlets of the Outer Banks stretched wide, their channels shifting with the seasons, creating a landscape both fertile and treacherous. In 1587, this remote stretch of coast became the destination for an ambitious English venture, a colony meant to establish England's permanent presence in the New World. Yet the land itself seemed to conspire with time, keeping the fate of its settlers shrouded in silence, as if every wave carried away the echoes of their brief, vanished lives. Even the cry of seabirds and the distant roar of surf seemed to echo the absence of human voices. Families arrived from England, their hopes folded into every crate of supplies, unaware that history would remember them for their absence rather than their achievements. Men and women, along with children of varying ages, disembarked onto the sandy shores, imagining a new life in a foreign land. Skilled craftsmen, labourers and farmers carried the promise of civilization, bringing tools and provisions intended to transform the island into a lasting settlement. They were greeted by a wilderness both beautiful and unforgiving, with dense forests, tidal marshes, and an unpredictable climate that demanded constant attention. Even the faint scent of salt and pine mingled with uncertainty, setting the tone for a life that would quickly test their resilience. Clearing the tangled undergrowth demanded relentless labour, each swing of the axe punctuated by the cries of children and the murmurs of exhausted settlers. They built crude shelters from timber and palisades, tilled soil for crops, and scavenged the coastline for sustenance. Daily life oscillated between fleeting moments of triumph and persistent struggle, as the settlers adapted to a land that held far more challenges than the ordered streets of London had ever presented. The rhythm of labour and survival became the backbone of a fragile community, entirely unaware that their endurance would be memorialised not by achievement, but by disappearance. Even small injuries and illnesses, minor by modern standards, compounded the constant strain on these newcomers. Hope and anxiety coexisted in every glance toward the horizon, where weeks of silence from England stretched like a shadow over the fragile community. Letters and promises of resupply remained distant, delayed by warships, weather, and political complications back home. The colonists grew increasingly uneasy, knowing that isolation magnified every misstep and intensified each threat. Be it illness, scarcity, or miscommunication with neighbouring indigenous groups. Within the daily routines of building and farming, an undercurrent of tension pulsed, a reminder that survival hinged not only on skill but on sheer fortune. Even a misjudged tide or sudden storm carried the potential for catastrophe. Supplies dwindled while leadership stood distant, leaving the colonists to confront both environmental hardship and the quiet dread of uncertainty alone. John White, the appointed governor, had departed for England to secure additional support, leaving behind a community struggling to maintain both morale and infrastructure. Disease, hunger, and the harsh winters of the Outer Banks compounded the settlers' vulnerability. Each day stretched endlessly, and every decision carried weight that could determine life or death, the unknown amplifying even ordinary tasks into matters of survival. The settlers' conversations, often whispered late at night around small fires, betrayed both fear and wonder at the strange land they now inhabited. When the returning ships finally approached, only empty foundations and the single word Croatoan carved into wood greeted their eyes, a silent riddle etched into the settlement. No bodies were found, no signs of conflict, no note of departure, only a single clue whose meaning was debated immediately and continues to be debated centuries later. The abrupt absence of families, structures and livestock left White and his crew in stunned disbelief. Every plank and post seemed to whisper unanswered questions, amplifying the tension between what was documented and what would remain forever unknown. Even the chill in the winter air seemed to magnify the haunting emptiness. Marshes and shifting inlets transformed the landscape into a labyrinth, hiding any evidence of human activity as effectively as the dense forest surrounding them. Tides could swallow footprints in hours, and storms could erase makeshift trails or scatter provisions into the sea. The colonists, if they had attempted to flee or hide, might have been absorbed into this unforgiving environment, leaving no trace for the returning party to follow. The island itself became a character in the story, its natural rhythms both protector and confounder, preserving the mystery in every mudflat and tidal creek. Even the faint rustle of reeds in the wind suggested secrets long concealed. Conversations and tentative alliances with local tribes left traces in historical records, suggesting integration, tension, or migration, though no evidence conclusively explains what happened. Indigenous peoples such as the Croatoan were known to inhabit surrounding regions, and some later accounts hint that survivors may have joined nearby communities. Still, these records are inconsistent, fragmentary, and often filtered through second-hand interpretations, leaving historians to navigate a landscape of conjecture supported by only sparse artifacts. Every fragment offers a possibility, yet none confirms the fate of the settlers. Scholars continue to debate whether the colony vanished entirely or merged quietly into local populations. Fragments of pottery, broken tools, and remnants of dwellings uncovered centuries later provide hints of daily life, yet they stop short of revealing the colony's ultimate fate. Archaeologists have found materials consistent with 16th century English settlers along Roanoke and Croatoan territories, but the quantity and distribution of such items suggest only temporary occupation. Each discovery prompts new questions. Were these remnants left behind in flight, traded with natives, or displaced by natural forces? The more evidence is collected, the more elusive the truth seems, as though the past itself resists being fully reconstructed. Every shard and splinter feels like a whisper of lives abruptly interrupted, ambition and peril intertwined in the broader context of European colonization, framing the disappearance as both a human tragedy and a reflection of the era's unforgiving challenges. England's geopolitical pressures, rivalry with Spain, and limited knowledge of the New World compounded the settlers' vulnerabilities. The Lost Colony was not merely a story of missing people, but a lens into the broader risks of exploration, survival, and imperial ambition in an unfamiliar landscape. The stakes extended beyond the individuals present on Roanoke. The event would shape colonial policy and imagination for generations. Even the relentless winds off the coast seem to remind all who came later of the settlers' precarious fate. Legends and scholarly inquiry have kept the story alive, blending folklore with historical investigation, ensuring that the mystery continues to provoke speculation and study. Over centuries, writers, historians, and explorers have debated theories, each adding layers to the story of disappearance. From possible massacres to assimilation into local tribes, no single narrative satisfies the evidence. The ambiguity itself sustains fascination, turning a 16th century event into an enduring puzzle whose answers remain frustratingly out of reach. Artifacts, old maps, and oral accounts continue to challenge assumptions as if the mystery evolves with each new generation. Scattered markers and archaeological remnants dot the island, suggesting lives once lived but offering no certainty, as though the land itself preserves an unanswered question. Visitors today walk paths trodden by colonists, encountering traces of fortifications, artifacts, and signs of habitation that hint at daily routines and sudden interruption. The landscape holds memory without explanation, the marshes and forests silent witnesses to what transpired. Every step taken on these grounds reinforces both the reality of human endeavour and the profound enigma of complete disappearance. Even a sudden bird call or the swirl of wind over the dunes can feel like an echo of vanished voices. Centuries later, the name Croatoan remains etched in both history and imagination, a silent clue to a colony that vanished without a trace. Salem Village, Massachusetts. Fear turned deadly. Candlelight flickered across wooden walls, casting shadows that seemed to shift with every whispered accusation. In the summer of 1692, Salem Village existed as a tightly knit Puritan community where conformity and obedience shaped daily life. The creaking floorboards and faint sighs in the night carried more than the mundane. They hinted at a pervasive unease that no one could entirely name. Stories of witches and dark spirits, often told in hushed tones by firesides, interwove with the rhythms of work and worship. In these small houses, ordinary routines were already coloured by suspicion, and even the sound of a door slamming seemed to echo with ominous significance. Faith and fear were inseparable here, guiding every step yet sharpening the dangers hidden in ordinary actions. The villagers' worldview was structured around divine providence and the unseen influence of Satan, rendering everyday misfortune a possible sign of spiritual corruption. Every cough, slip, or quarrelling neighbour could be interpreted as a subtle warning of malevolence. The Puritan emphasis on piety and moral vigilance meant that even minor social infractions or unexplained illnesses were scrutinized through a lens of eternal consequence. In such a society, the boundary between reality and interpretation was perilously thin, leaving inhabitants perpetually on edge. Conversations at the hearth carried an undercurrent of suspicion, as neighbours weighed each word and gesture with caution. Families discussed neighbours' behaviour in careful whispers, reading meaning into casual remarks or unfamiliar expressions. Gossip, though seemingly trivial, functioned as a form of social surveillance, identifying those whose actions might betray hidden allegiances or secret sins. Children were observed constantly, their play interpreted as either innocent mischief or early signs of possession. In these interactions, subtle shifts in tone or glance could transform routine conversations into instruments of fear, and once an accusation surfaced, it rarely remained isolated. Children's strange behaviours unsettled even the most devout, their unexplained fits interpreted as evidence of an unseen malevolence. Young girls began to convulse and exhibit alarming gestures, sometimes screaming of invisible tormentors or naming neighbours in fits of fear and confusion. Scholars note that these behaviours may have had medical, psychological, or social origins, yet the villagers read them as proof of witchcraft. Each convulsion or accusation reinforced communal anxiety, creating a feedback loop in which fear amplified perception and perception confirmed fear. The children became both victims and instruments of a system that blurred innocence and guilt into a single terrifying framework. Rumours travelled faster than the wind, infiltrating homes and meeting houses, leaving the villagers unsure of whom to trust. Ordinary disputes over property, inheritance, or personal grievances were recast as signs of hidden evil. A neighbour who had quarrelled the week before might suddenly be labelled complicit in dark magic, and friends became reluctant allies in a network of suspicion. Even strangers passing through the village were eyed warily, as the lines between community and outsider blurred under collective fear. The invisible threat of witchcraft became tangible, moving through the population like an unseen contagion, infecting trust and reason alike. Ministers and magistrates found themselves wielding authority over both truth and perception, compelled to adjudicate the unseen as much as the tangible. Reverend Samuel Parris and other local leaders carried immense responsibility, tasked with protecting spiritual and social order while responding to reports of bewitched behaviour. Their sermons, public pronouncements, and guidance in court often amplified fear, translating rumours into official testimony. The merging of religious and civil authority meant that suspicion could be codified as law, and private anxieties became communal obligations. In this environment, the line between personal grievance and criminal accusation was so blurred that any act could be elevated into evidence. One accusation led to another, spiralling into a web where long-standing grievances were suddenly legitimised by the language of witchcraft. A single neighbour named could implicate dozens, and minor disputes or old resentments were recast as threats to spiritual safety. Patterns of accusation often reflected social hierarchies, envy, or family tensions, but in the eyes of the court and villagers, these motivations were irrelevant. The act of naming someone became a tool of both defence and self-preservation, as accusing others offered protection against suspicion. Over time, the network of allegations expanded, drawing in more victims and perpetuating a cycle of fear that was increasingly impossible to escape. Courtrooms became stages of fear, where testimony and confession dictated lives, and the weight of judgment was both immediate and irreversible. The Massachusetts Court of Oyez and Terminer heard accounts from afflicted children, witnesses, and accused townspeople, often relying on spectral evidence, a controversial and highly subjective form of proof. Confessions extracted under pressure confirmed pre-existing fears, and sentences were swift and severe. Hanging, imprisonment, and social exile were the ultimate consequences of being named, reinforcing a culture in which accusation itself carried as much power as actual guilt. Every proceeding amplified tension, leaving villagers anxious about who might be next. Families struggled under the strain, with old resentments erupting and relationships unravelling as paranoia seeped into every corner of the community. Siblings, neighbours, and friends found themselves pitted against one another, unsure if loyalty or silence offered protection. Many endured public shaming or private anguish, as accusations and rumours spread without regard for evidence or character. The psychological toll was profound, with grief and terror interwoven into daily life, creating a community fractured both physically and emotionally. Even those untouched directly by the courts bore the burden of living under a constant spectre of suspicion. Diaries, letters, and official court records preserve fragments of the hysteria, offering glimpses of motives, fears, and the relentless escalation of events. Contemporary accounts provide insight into the mechanisms of accusation, the strategies of defence, and the religious framework that shaped interpretation. researchers today can trace the sequence of accusations, the social connections between accusers and accused, and the outcomes of trials. Yet these documents, as comprehensive as they appear, leave gaps in understanding the human experience of fear. The mystery endures not because of a lack of documentation, but because fear itself resists complete comprehension. In later generations, Salem Village became synonymous with the perils of collective fear, its story a cautionary reflection on human vulnerability to suspicion. The events of 1692 are remembered as a case study in the consequences of unchecked paranoia, social rigidity, and the intertwining of spiritual and civil authority. Scholars, writers, and historians continue to examine the social, psychological, and cultural factors that allowed the tragedy to unfold. The village's narrative serves as a warning about how fear, once institutionalized, can override reason, erode empathy, and lead to irreversible consequences. Shadows of doubt linger in the historical record, reminding modern observers that the interplay of belief and fear can yield consequences far beyond imagination. Every execution, imprisonment, and accusation is preserved as evidence of a society in which mistrust became a governing force. The psychological and cultural echoes of Salem Village continue to inspire reflection on the nature of suspicion, authority, and human vulnerability. Its lessons endure, showing how a small community can be consumed from within when fear spreads faster than understanding. Long after the gallows were dismantled, the whispers of suspicion lingered in Salem, a reminder that fear can outlive even the most tangible evidence of its victims.